look at you, not even good enough to fake it properly." The officer's voice rang out, sharp and dripping with contempt, tearing through the already frigid air of the checkpoint. Evelyn Maddox, a black woman clad in a crisp military uniform, stood there, composed. No combat ID in hand, but every crease in that uniform bore the marks of pride and years of service. Yet to him, it was nothing but a cheap act. Because of her skin color, because of the calm in her eyes, no questions asked. No second thoughts. The handcuffs swung up, heavy as a verdict already written, the moment she crossed the checkpoint's threshold. The crowd watched. No one spoke. No one frowned. Only Evelyn, her face unchanged, her eyes deep like a black hole, colder than the winter raging outside. He did not know. He had no idea. The woman he just humiliated was Major General Evelyn Maddox, a silent force strong enough to sweep away the rotten system he clung to, and when the phone in her hand buzzed for the first time, everything he believed in began to crumble. You think wearing a uniform earns you respect? You think justice is for everyone? Think again. Here, skin color remains an invisible sentence, and sometimes just a single glance is enough to strangle a person's dignity. Which state are you living in? And are you truly sure that justice exists where you are? The matte black SUV came to a stop at the far end of the district administration parking lot. The midday sun beat down on the windshield, reflecting a blurred image of a row of national flags swaying in the breeze. The military license plate was partially obscured by a layer of dust, not the kind from highways, but the sort that clings to vehicles from training fields or deployment lots. The door opened without a sound. A black woman stepped out. She wore civilian attire, sand-colored khakis, a dark polo shirt, weathered military boots, no handbag, no sunglasses, no jacket, even though the sun was burning her brow. She stood tall, scanned her surroundings once, and paused for exactly 3 seconds on a sign that read, "Reserved parking for senior personnel, credentials required." Then she locked the car with a swift, practiced movement that told you she wasn't trying to blend in or stand out. She was simply someone long accustomed to being precise in both gesture and presence. She slipped her keys into her front pocket and walked toward the administration building, shoulders steady, spine straight, stride unyielding. At that same moment, Kyle Renner had just returned from patrol and parked his cruiser across the street. His gaze landed on the SUV, parked properly, then on the woman stepping out. His eyes narrowed, not from the sun, but from a reflex triggered by anyone he deemed out of place and worth watching. Kyle got out, slammed the door as if announcing himself, then crossed the street. No lights, no radio call, no backup. He approached from behind, didn't call out, just walked close enough that his footsteps echoed off the sun-baked concrete. The woman paused slightly, not from surprise, but out of a basic courtesy when someone moves in with such forceful intent. "Whose car is this?" Kyle asked, his tone low but laced with possessive suspicion. She turned without irritation. "Mine." Kyle raised an eyebrow. "That kind of vehicle is usually assigned to senior military personnel." She nodded. "I know." He eyed her outfit. "Got registration on you? You don't look like someone cleared to drive that." The woman didn't rush to answer. She pulled out a wallet and revealed an uncommon type of ID. Hard, thick ocean blue with a QR code and embossed seal. She held it not handing it over, just raising it to Kyle's eye level. He glanced at it, didn't touch it, then looked at her again. "Borrowed someone's ride? Doesn't match your skin tone if we're being honest." At that moment, the sunlight caught the top of the flagpole and bounced off Kyle's belt, right onto his silver handcuffs, which gleamed as if lit up. She noticed the glint, then replied, "It's not borrowed, and I don't need to match the paint job." Her voice was steady, unprovocative, a simple rebuttal to the unspoken implication. Kyle didn't like the way she said it. Not the words, the composure. He stepped closer, pressing each footstep into the cement. "I need to check the back of your vehicle. Got anything you need to declare?" "I'm not carrying any weapons. I'll be the one to determine that." "Do you have a warrant?" "I'm law enforcement. Suspicious vehicle checks are my right." "There's been no suspicious activity unless my outfitting your mental image counts." Kyle said nothing. He tilted his head, signaling for another patrol car to approach. The woman didn't turn around. She quietly returned the ID to her wallet and stood upright. As the second police car pulled in, a younger officer stepped out, face uncertain. Kyle moved in front of the woman, nearly blocking her path, then reached for his cuffs. "I'm going to have to detain you for identification verification. You've already seen my credentials. I can't confirm they're legitimate. Because I'm out of uniform? Or because they come from somewhere you don't think I belong?" Kyle didn't answer. He raised the cuffs. "Are you going to cooperate?" "I won't cooperate with a procedural violation. Then I have to cuff you." "No, you choose to." "Correct. And I've chosen." He snapped the cuffs shut. The metallic click rang out across the parking lot. A woman walking nearby froze. A child near the flagpole raised a camera and began recording. No shouting, no scuffle, but everyone could feel that something was being legitimized, and it didn't feel right. She didn't resist, didn't lower her head, didn't scan for help. She simply inhaled deeply, then walked with Kyle toward the patrol car as if entering a conference where she was the keynote speaker, and they just hadn't realized who they were escorting. Across the scorched concrete, their shadows stretched out, spilling over the painted parking lines, tracing the hazy boundary between dignity and prejudice. She walked without faltering, even though the ground beneath her feet radiated heat up to the nape of her neck, not from the concrete, but from the murky stairs trailing behind her. The handcuffs clasped evenly around her wrists, not tight enough to draw blood, not loose enough to forget. Cold metal that didn't pierce the skin, but sent a chill through it, the kind of chill felt not through nerve endings but through ancestral memory. It wasn't physical restraint. It was a reminder. This place had never been fair to those who didn't look like the ones they trusted. Kyle held her by the upper arm with just enough force not to be accused of assault, but enough to assert control. In that moment, the sound of his boots hitting the pavement had the cadence of someone escorting a prisoner, not a woman, and certainly not a high-ranking military officer. The young girl recording from the beginning, no more than 9 years old, with braided hair and an iPad almost bigger than her face, never put the device down. She didn't speak, but her wide eyes captured not just images, but emotion, confusion, helplessness, and a dry kind of curiosity. She didn't know who the woman was, but she knew one thing: the woman wasn't afraid. And in this world, those who aren't afraid in moments meant to scare them are rarely ordinary people. Kyle opened the back door of the patrol car. The woman entered without being pushed, but before she sat down, she asked, not loudly, not softly, just enough for Kyle to hear, "Have you ever thought you might be arresting the wrong person?" He didn't answer, but his eyes squinted, as if hit by sunlight. A strange reaction, since his polished cap was wide enough to shield his entire forehead. He slammed the door shut and moved to the driver's seat. The young officer who had accompanied him stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. There was a brief moment when her eyes met the younger officer's through the plexiglass divider. No words were exchanged, but her expression was so clear that the officer had to look away, as if unable to hold his gaze on a truth he wasn't ready to face. The car pulled away. No sirens, no flashing lights, just an ordinary transfer in the eyes of passers-by. But inside, the air was thick, like a waiting room between verdicts. The woman leaned back, breathing slowly. No one could see what ran through her mind. Maybe a map of the city. Maybe the face of a man her father once protected. Or maybe the names of soldiers under her command, training under the sun at a base hundreds of miles away. But one thing was clear. She had no regrets. Back in the parking lot, the little girl's iPad was still recording. A middle-aged woman walked up to the child and asked gently, "What are you doing, sweetie?" Recording, "I don't understand, but I saw that lady get arrested, even though she didn't do anything wrong. Do you know who she is?" "No, but I liked how she stood. She wasn't scared." The woman froze, a simple sentence, but it cracked open something in her memory. She had seen that look before. During the protest movement in Georgia years ago, when demonstrators stood their ground even as fire hoses aimed directly at their faces. No shouting, no fleeing, no heads bowed, just standing. And in that stillness was a question louder than any speech. Do you think I don't belong here? When the patrol car pulled up in front of the downtown police precinct, Kyle got out first, walked around to the other side, and opened the rear door. "Step out," he said, not in a commanding tone, just in the practiced cadence of someone used to exercising authority. The woman stood up, exited with the same unwavering gait, back straight, no trembling. But as she crossed the threshold of the automatic glass doors, she caught a glimpse of her reflection: silver handcuffs, faded combat boots, the silhouette of a soldier walking into a place that did not welcome her, not because it didn't know who she was, but because it had never been prepared to receive someone like her, a woman, a person of color, carrying a form of power they couldn't control. She was led into the holding area. No one spoke. A different officer at the front desk glanced at her name on the intake log, E. Maddox, then turned to Kyle. "Where's the paperwork?" She refused full compliance. "Had ID, but I'm skeptical." "What kind of ID?" "Military. Real or fake?" "Can't confirm." The other officer didn't press further, but something in his eyes faltered, as if the name Maddox had rung a distant bell from military rosters or a weekend segment on public affairs. Not a common name, but not unfamiliar to someone who'd ever served in the system. Meanwhile, the little girl's iPad kept recording. She didn't know that her short video, just a few minutes long, would become the opening footage for a nationwide outrage. She didn't know that within hours, the name Evelyn Maddox would be trending across the country. But what she did know in that exact moment was that she was capturing something adults often overlook, a silence that could indict louder than any slogan. Handcuffs, cold, lifeless metal, were designed to bind the wrists of the guilty, but when wrapped around the arms of someone who deserved a podium instead of a patrol car, they became evidence of a system that had misused its own. And that evening, as sunlight streamed through the precinct's tall windows and struck the wall where a motto read, "Serve, protect, justice," every person who passed it had to ask themselves, does justice always wear a badge, or does it sometimes stand on the other side, in cuffs, but with its head held high? Beneath the wall that bore the motto, "Serve, protect, justice," Evelyn Maddox sat still, her hands still cuffed behind her back, but the plastic chair could not support the full weight of her upright spine. Plastic seats, glaring white lights, and the pungent blend of printer paper, cheap vinyl, and sweat combined into the thick air typical of every district-level precinct. In the small room where she'd been left to wait because no one quite knew how to process her, the wall clock ticked forward with bored precision, second by second. But she didn't look at it. Her eyes were fixed on the table, scratched, coffee-stained, and carved into with a ballpoint pen that read, "Truth dies here." No one noticed it. No one had bothered to scrub it off, as if the whole system had long accepted that truth only existed within the limits permitted by those who wrote the reports. She didn't regret staying silent all this time. Silence was a weapon, not one used to resist, but to sort people. Those who spoke too much were often those least certain of themselves. The truly dangerous ones didn't explain. They waited for the right moment, not to retaliate, but to remind. Evelyn knew that rule intimately. During her years serving in strategic hotspots for the Department of Defense, she had seen countless failures dressed up in rhetoric, but never had she seen any words undo the consequences of a phone call made to the right person at the right time. When the door opened and Kyle walked in, he held a basic intake form. Not enough text, no proper legal basis, just a paper meant to justify the unlawful detention of a civilian. "We're going to hold you for ID verification. You may be impersonating a military officer," he said, his voice not as sharp as it had been outside, but still clipped, still habitually pressing down on words that sounded like conclusions. Evelyn didn't argue. For the first time since arriving, she simply asked, "Am I allowed a phone call?" Kyle chuckled, half mocking, half baiting. "Gonna call your lawyer?" "No," she replied crisply. "I'm calling the Department of Defense." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, not because Kyle knew what was coming, but because he didn't understand how someone like her could say those words so calmly. as if she had rehearsed them in front of a mirror. She tilted her head slightly, revealing the angular line of her jaw and a small scar just below her ear, the kind only those who had crossed real battlefields bore. He didn't notice the scar. His eyes were fixed on the landline telephone on the desk, its spiral cord frayed, its number pad worn down. He nodded. "One call, no more than a minute. I only need 17 seconds. She said. Evelyn was uncuffed, still inside the room, without direct supervision. She picked up the receiver and dialed a sequence of numbers that no one at the precinct had ever seen. No area code, no country code. Just a short, firm string. When the line connected, she didn't give her name or location. She said, "Henderson, Code Tango, Echo 15. I'm in custody." The voice on the other end was calm, neither raised nor panicked. "I'll take care of it." She hung up, said nothing more. Kyle, standing in the corner with his arms folded, sneered. "Code words? Sounds like some kind of game." Evelyn didn't respond. She stared directly at him, not mocking, not pitying, just with the look of someone who already knew the ending, watching the others stumble toward it, unable to change course. 17 seconds? No more needed. No pleading. No tears. No need to prove anything. For Evelyn Maddox, the phone call wasn't for her safety. It was protocol. A protocol designed exclusively for individuals on a protected personnel list issued by the Joint Chiefs. A list Kyle had never heard of because he wasn't high-ranking enough to know it existed. She was returned to the waiting area. Kyle resumed processing paperwork, but while he rifled through drawers looking for a military personnel verification form, the internal line rang. Once, twice, 3 times. He ignored it. On the 4th ring, another officer stepped in. "They're asking for you." "I'm busy." "No." The call's from Armed Forces Command. Kyle froze. A nerve along the left side of his neck twitched. He picked up, pressed the button, and raised the receiver. The voice on the line didn't identify itself. It asked one question. "Is this Sergeant Kyle Renner handling the detention of an individual named Evelyn Maddox?" "Yes. I'm currently—" "Cease all proceedings. Release the individual immediately. This is a directive from Lieutenant General Henderson's office confirming Code Tango Echo 15 Priority 1 clearance. No discussion. No delay. If this directive is not executed within 5 minutes, the Department of Justice will be informed of obstruction of national security protocol." Kyle hung up the phone like someone who had pulled a trigger without realizing the barrel was pointed at himself. He didn't look up, didn't speak, and for the first time since the encounter began, he was entirely silenced. Not because his opponent had made a better argument, but because he had just realized he was never qualified to start the argument in the first place. Evelyn remained in the waiting room. Her posture is unchanged. She didn't ask for updates, didn't press for an outcome, because for her, an outcome was never about closure. It was the paragraph already written. For those who understood that silence was the most authoritative voice when the world around them was shouting too much. The small room, which minutes earlier had been a place to interrogate a suspected military impersonator, was now the space where everyone had to ask themselves, who was impersonating authority, and why was a brief phone call enough to stop an entire system in its tracks, not out of fear of error, but fear of messing with the wrong person. When Kyle put down the receiver for the 2nd time, his hand was still damp with sweat, even though the waiting room wasn't hot. The tone in the voice of the man on the other end of the line was neither loud nor heavy, but carried a cold finality that Kyle had never heard before. It didn't sound like a station superior, nor a local judge, and certainly not the familiar warnings from civilian complaints he'd always dismissed with ease. It was the voice of someone who didn't need to raise it, because behind him stood an entire apparatus where any sound he made was enough to bring a city to a halt. Kyle took a breath, then stepped out of the room. This time his steps lacked confidence. He was no longer walking to handle the woman. He was walking to find the answer to a question that had never before crossed his mind. What did I just touch? Evelyn Maddox still sat calmly, hands resting on her lap, her wrists red from the cuffs but not bruised, eyes fixed on the frosted glass door, as if waiting for someone unannounced to arrive. No one looked at her, but everyone felt that something was off. The system they operated had been trained in, and they thought it was airtight. Now it felt like a machine whose gear had slipped. A small slip, but enough to make the entire mechanism stop and reconsider. At a terminal, a duty officer, Ramirez, quietly began searching the name just mentioned, Evelyn Maddox. At first, a blank screen. Then, a lock symbol with 3 levels of encryption. Ramirez hesitated, then entered an access code reserved for civilian military coordination. The screen shifted to a new interface, deep navy blue, displaying a warning. Access limited. Clearance Tier 1 required. Ramirez didn't speak. He looked at Kyle with an expression that wasn't a warning. It was a notification. We're dealing with someone we're not authorized to look up. 1 minute later, the station chief arrived. No one had summoned him, but he knew. Because the phone call hadn't stopped with Kyle, it had been routed to the entire chain of local administrative command. And when a lieutenant general from the Joint Chiefs activated Code Tango Echo 15, the national security protocol engaged. Even if it was just an administrative incident, he entered the room and swept his gaze across it. He didn't look at Evelyn first. He looked at Kyle, as if assessing whether the man still belonged to the power structure they all served. Then he asked simply, "Are you sure the person you're detaining is an impersonator?" Kyle said nothing. The chief didn't wait for an answer. He turned to Evelyn. "Apologies for the delay, Major General Maddox." The sentence wasn't loud, but the entire station went silent. No one had imagined the quiet black woman sitting there was a major general, not because they believed black women couldn't be generals, but because the system they were trained in had never taught them to recognize it as a real possibility. Kyle was speechless. He looked at Evelyn as if seeing someone he'd known before, and yet realizing he'd never actually known her at all. Every authority he thought he had, the right to detain, to suspect, to decide on the ground, crumbled in that one phrase. Major General. It didn't need explanation. It wasn't just a rank on a document. It was a statement that she did not belong to the tier of society he had the authority to judge. She was above, not just above him, but above the entire system he had believed was untouchable. Evelyn didn't show pride. She rose gently, adjusted her collar and nodded. "I'm fine, but this isn't the first time." The station chief didn't know how to respond. He motioned for Kyle to step aside. Kyle walked away, heavy-footed, his back slightly bent, for the first time not walking like a police officer, but like a man stripped of a badge he hadn't realized he no longer deserved to wear. Meanwhile, Ramirez silently printed a page from the system he'd just accessed, using a special authentication code from the Department of Defense. The page held only one line: Evelyn Maddox, Active Commander, Strategic Replenishment Division, Clearance Level Alpha Prime. At the bottom was the Silver Eagle seal, the internal insignia of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, used only in situations of strategic emergency or internal intervention concerning high-level personnel under active command. Ramirez walked past Evelyn, holding the document with both hands, as if returning something he never had the right to keep. Evelyn didn't take it back. She simply said, "Keep it for proper documentation, not to intimidate, but to retrain a system that had forgotten. Real authority isn't what's pinned on your chest. It's what survives even when denied." The station chief escorted Evelyn to the exit. Along the way, no one spoke, but every eye that followed her was no longer a skeptical one. Was it fear? No, it was recognition. Recognition that they had just witnessed one of the gravest errors in their field, wrongfully touching someone, and worse, hurting someone the entire system was designed to protect. And in the very place that was supposed to be the stronghold of those who controlled power, that day, Evelyn Maddox walked out. Not escorted, not scrutinized, not asked for papers. Everything was clear. It's just that no one dared to acknowledge it sooner. So, when the automatic glass doors opened and the midday sunlight spilled onto the front steps of the precinct, what people saw wasn't just a woman leaving. What they saw was a system, silently rewritten by the presence of a name they weren't high-ranking enough to forget. When Evelyn stepped through the glass doors of the local police headquarters, no one stopped her, but no one escorted her either. Everyone stood still, as if they had just seen off a figure who no longer fell under their jurisdiction. Not because someone had issued a command, but because everyone instinctively understood that this moment no longer belonged to any administrative level present. It was a moment when identity no longer needed to be repeated, because her presence had already said everything. Beneath the harsh midday sun, the sight of her walking, quiet, composed, but with the stride of someone who had once led thousands of soldiers across crisis borders, left a silent aftershock in the hearts of every observer. On the other end of the line, inside the third floor of the Pentagon, Lieutenant General Charles Henderson placed the receiver down on the voice-encrypted secure line. He needed no further confirmation. All relevant data had been clear long before Evelyn Maddox had been called an imposter. No call from her was ever routine, but the fact that she had used code Tango Echo 15, a directive reserved for strategic-level commanders facing emergencies on U.S. territory, triggered not just his office, but the entire internal response chain. From Rapid Operations Command to the Joint Federal Security Liaison Bureau, from the Military Legal Department to the JAG Corps' Special Protection Team, all had received a flagged internal alert, marked with two identifying keywords: Maddox. Civilian conflict. The first order issued was not to rescue her. Evelyn didn't need rescuing. Chefano heard she had survived operations so classified that even their names were omitted from congressional records. What had to be done was to immediately neutralize the possibility of further abuse of authority enabled by the local system. So, while Kyle Renner was still fumbling in the back room, trying to complete an incident report to close the case, every fax machine in the precinct began spitting out an emergency directive printed on red paper, the kind used only in situations threatening the integrity of federal defense systems. The top line read, "Emergency Order, Strategic Command Office, Directive 147/Delta/Immediate." Within less than 3 minutes of Evelyn leaving the precinct, the internal phone rang for the second time. No one answered. No one had the nerve to, except the station chief, the only person in the building who maintained composure beyond the surface. He picked up the line. "Central Precinct, Chief Day speaking." The voice on the other end was low, even-toned, and carried no trace of anger. Only the clinical efficiency of a system that no longer had a second to wait. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Mallory, Internal Response Security Joint Chiefs of Staff. We are confirming the following. A currently active Major General of the Department of Defense was detained in violation of civilian protocol. We request an immediate report. A list of all individuals involved in the handcuffing decision, the interrogator, the person who signed the detainment order, and any related surveillance data. Deadline, 30 minutes. Day didn't ask why. He simply started writing. 1 minute later, Kyle was summoned to the command room. He entered, still wearing the expression of a man who had not yet grasped what was happening. He sat down, and in his entire career as a police officer, Kyle had never seen a meeting table fall this silent. No exploratory questions, no professional jargon. No one referred to him as officer anymore. From that moment forward, in all internal reports, he was only Renner, the individual involved in a breach concerning an active military officer. Later that same day, the Military Legal Office issued a request to review the entirety of Kyle's 6-year conduct record, focusing on all past administrative checks involving minority civilians or reserve military personnel. The typically sluggish internal review system was replaced with a special investigation unit, granted access to all local server data. No warrant, no authorization needed, and when a legal coordination team from the Department of Defense walked into the precinct just 5 hours after the initial incident, no one dared to stop them, not because they wore uniforms, but because they didn't need to prove they had the right to be there. While Kyle was placed on administrative isolation to facilitate the internal investigation, every piece of data related to Evelyn Maddox's arrest was backed up under the designation Classified Incident Military Overlap, a term police officers usually only encountered in news segments about border checkpoint misconduct or federal task force joint operations. But this time, It hadn't happened at a border or a base or in a jurisdictional gray area. It had happened in the heart of a peaceful city, and the target had been a woman in civilian clothes, driving a personal vehicle, who had caused no disturbance, shown no resistance, and concealed no weapons. And that woman was a United States Army general, inside one of the Pentagon's secure rooms. A digital board updated with the new entry, Operation Retrace, stating, "Initiate mission to reassess the entire intersection of civilian enforcement and military authority in administrative procedures." A small footnote beneath the update read, "Case Catalyst, General Maddox, Civilian Conflict, Tier 1 Override." Evelyn didn't need to know what the system was doing to make amends. She had never relied on the system. She had only done her part, sent a signal no one could ignore, and left the rest to those who had sworn to uphold the nation's honor against ignorance at the front lines. That phone call, only 17 seconds long, hadn't just pulled one building to its feet. It had shaken an entire structure that believed itself immune to every other layer of power. Evelyn hadn't even retaliated. She had only picked up the phone. She did not walk away in haste, nor did she look back. Behind the automatic glass doors that had just closed stood an entire system, still trying to grasp how in less than an hour, every protocol, every definition, every metric of authority they were used to operating by had been overturned. Not by someone who flashed credentials, not by someone who raised their voice, and certainly not by someone who begged for forgiveness. Evelyn Maddox walked away as if she had just wrapped up a meeting, not as if she had just been released from an unlawful arrest. No more handcuffs, no more stares glued to her movements, no more rustling of papers in the room behind her, but also no one stepped forward to escort or see her out, not because they lacked courtesy, but because they understood that in that moment her presence was no longer something they had the right to stand beside, let alone walk alongside. On the front steps of the precinct, sunlight slanted through the flagpoles, casting streaks of glowing heat across the pavement. Beautiful, but not to be touched. Evelyn paused at the top stair, then turned, not out of regret, not out of anger, and certainly not to cast blame. Her eyes swept across the glass facade, reflecting the entire lobby, where Kyle Renner stood frozen, caught between a quiet panic and a kind of bruised self that he couldn't name. No one had told him to remain there, but he couldn't make himself walk anywhere else. He clutched the edge of a desk, not out of fatigue, but to balance a self-impose that had just collapsed with no replacement in sight. Evelyn's gaze stopped for exactly 3 seconds, no more. But in those 3 seconds, no one except her and Kyle truly understood what was happening. No words, no overt gestures, but every nerve in Kyle's body felt that this was not a look of contempt, nor was it one of forgiveness. It was the gaze of someone who had seen, clearly, the moral boundary of the person before her, and had chosen not to intervene. It wasn't cold, but it made the skin crawl. It wasn't sharp, but it quieted the soul, and it didn't need to be loud, because everything that needed to be said was already contained in the way Evelyn turned back around and walked away without another word. The automatic door opened again, this time for a young officer rushing out with internal documents in hand, but when he saw Evelyn descending the steps, he stopped. In his hand was a hard copy report stamped urgent, one of the rare documents required to be preserved in print rather than digital. He didn't call out to her, didn't run up. He simply stood still. Then, moved by an instinct no training manual could teach, he raised his hand in a military salute, though he had never served. Evelyn didn't return the salute with her hand. She didn't need to. A slight nod, barely visible unless you stood at the right angle, was enough. Enough to acknowledge, enough to confirm he understood. In the distance, a car horn sounded. A black civilian sedan quietly pulled up across the street. No special plates, no escort, no flags. The driver didn't step out, didn't honk again. They knew she would arrive at the exact moment. Evelyn crossed the road, no rush, no backward glance. But from the second floor of the precinct, an administrative staff member who had worked there for 11 years instinctively pulled the curtain closed. Not because of the sun, but because he couldn't bear to watch that moment unfold again. A black woman walking away, as if she had never been handcuffed inside the very place that called itself a center of justice. On a windless afternoon, the moment that struck hardest was not a scream, not the echo of boots pounding across a hall, nor the slamming of fists onto desks that officers often use to express defiance. It was a look, 3 seconds, not condemning, not generous, not seeking sympathy, but one that stripped down a man, a system, and a title, leaving them bare with nothing to cling to. And the most painful part of it all was this: Evelyn didn't need to look back. It was her not looking back that made everyone else turn around. Kyle didn't know how long he had stood there. When he finally moved, the desk beneath his hand bore a damp imprint. No one questioned him. No one looked at him. And strangely, that was the punishment. Not because Evelyn had done anything to him, but because he knew. From that moment on, he was no longer someone worthy of her glance, not even once more. He had once believed that others' gazes were a form of power to control, but today he learned the opposite. Some looks carry enough weight to make a person reconstruct their entire definition of character without ever touching a single handcuff. The next morning, the sunlight wasn't as bright as the day before, but the ground still felt hot, not because of the weather, but because something lingered, something that not even air conditioning, UV-protected glass, or manufactured busyness could wash away. A thick silence, unnamed, uncommanded, yet unanimously obeyed. The central precinct opened on time. The time clock beeped routinely as personnel filed in and out. The duty desk flipped through paperwork. The coffee machine dripped its usual trail of hot brown liquid. But no one spoke. No one greeted anyone. No one asked how the previous evening had gone. And especially no one uttered the name Evelyn Maddox. Kyle didn't show up. No one asked why. There was no official announcement. On his desk, a half-written note remained, the pen's tip pressed deep into the thin paper, the last line scratched out incompletely, only half of the words visible. No one knew if it was suspect or sorry. His chair remained empty, not because the department hadn't reassigned the seat, but because no one felt morally secure enough to sit in it without trembling. And strangely, that wasn't something debated. No one suggested it, but the chair stayed vacant all morning. A veteran officer passed Kyle's desk 3 times. He never stopped, never looked at the drawer, the one where Kyle kept his backup firearm, and a notebook of controversial encounters. Normally, this officer loved bringing up past stories, boasting of holding the line with firm action. But today, he said nothing. He made coffee, added sugar to the cup, but left it untouched the whole morning. When he returned later, the coffee had gone cold. He poured it down the sink without drinking a drop. People say silence is golden, but here, silence was seismic, and everyone could feel its aftershock, not through sound, but in how they avoided eye contact when passing each other in the hall. Talia, the young officer in charge of the internal surveillance systems, was the only one who interacted with the footage that day. She knew the clip showing Evelyn's arrest had already been backed up, encrypted, and sent to the federal security network the night before. But this morning, when she logged in again, the system had automatically revoked her access. In its place, a red alert line appeared. Asset under federal review, no civilian or departmental access permitted. Talia sat still for a full minute, then shut down her screen. She didn't ask anyone, didn't file a report. In her heart, nothing else needed confirmation. When a clip is sealed by the Pentagon, the story no longer belongs to what she could call internal. Another officer, someone who had chatted with Kyle every morning, took the longer west hallway just to avoid walking past Kyle's office. The reason was simple. Anyone who passed by could see the facts taped to the window. A copy of the emergency directive from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, red-stamped, with a small line at the bottom, "Internal warning, incident contains potential federal violation." No one had been ordered to read it, but everyone did, and after reading, no one had anything left to say. That silence wasn't fear, it was the retreat of awareness. The moment a system was drowned in a truth no one wanted to face. We treated someone who deserved reverence like a criminal, not because we had a reason, but because we lacked the imagination to see that she was more. The meeting room door was still open, but there was no morning briefing. The lieutenant assigned to lead it, one of those present during the arrest, had emailed in for a day off. No reason given. Inside the department, someone jokingly texted, "Guess he needs a day to digest the Maddox mess." But the message lasted only a few seconds in the group chat before the sender deleted it, not out of fear of disciplinary action, but because they knew there was nothing left to joke about. No one said it, but everyone understood. A system can only operate normally when it still believes it is right. Today, that belief was gone. Around midday, the front desk received a call, not from a civilian, not from the press. The caller identified herself as an administrative liaison from the Office of Legal Ethics Oversight. Calm voice, female, requesting permission to send reference materials related to organizational behavior analysis in power abuse cases between administrative and military hierarchies. The officer nodded, wrote it down, and said nothing more. But after hanging up, he turned to the colleague next to him and shook his head slightly. No one needed to ask why. They knew. Today was the day the system began to reflect on itself, not through a mirror, but through an absence, where there should have been Kyle, an apology, an official meeting, but instead there was nothing. Talia returned to her desk at day's end. She looked at the monitor, then turned away without logging in. She opened her notebook and wrote down a single line. I saw it, not to submit, not to archive, but to remind herself that, on an afternoon that seemed uneventful, an entire system built on habit, command, and repetition had been awakened. By a woman who didn't need to shout, didn't need to raise a weapon, and didn't need to prove anything beyond her simple, undeniable presence. As dusk settled, the last golden streaks of sunlight stretched across the sidewalk like spills no one bothered to clean up. The western neighborhood of the city remained quiet, unchanged. No sirens. No patrols. No one is knocking with urgency, but outside a second-floor apartment, beneath a pale gray door with no nameplate, a man stood waiting. He wore no uniform. No badge, no insignia. His suit resembled the kind seen at closed-door congressional hearings. Not stylish, but thick enough to conceal a sidearm if needed. Discreet enough for people to forget he had ever served anywhere at all. In his hand was a black envelope, thick, unsealed, with no postage and no sender. It was not carried in an inner office pouch. He had held it in his hand the entire walk from the parking lot to this door, as though delivering it personally was part of the message it carried. He did not knock immediately. He waited until the footsteps inside paused. Someone stood behind the door. They did not open it. They did not ask who was there, but they knew. The door opened. Kyle Renner said nothing. The man handed him the envelope. No explanation, no smile, no warning, just a nod. Not friendly, not hostile, but the final confirmation of a process already concluded. Kyle took it, his hand trembling slightly, not because of the envelope's weight, it was lighter than he expected, but because of what it represented, a reckoning he had never imagined would arrive in person. As the man turned away, Kyle still had not opened it. He stood in the doorway for several more seconds, not locking it, not even fully closing it. Then, slowly, he pushed it shut. The room inside was dim, but the remaining daylight through the window was enough to illuminate the kitchen table, where Kyle placed the envelope. He stared at it like a verdict not yet read, as if by not opening it he could pause reality. But it did not pause, because the only thing that truly stopped was the illusion that every mistake could be justified with a title and a signature. He opened the envelope. Inside were 4 sheets of paper. The first was a still image from the handcuffing video. He had seen it before, but this time it came printed from 3 separate angles: body cam, traffic cam, and the footage taken by a child. The second sheet was a list every administrative stop Kyle had initiated with black civilians over the past 3 years. 8 in total. 3 had prompted formal complaints. 1 had required an internal review. He had believed they were all buried, but now they were back, orderly, complete with case numbers and status updates, reopened. The third sheet was handwritten. No header, no signature. The first line read, "I don't need you to explain. I need you to recall every time you mistook someone's silence for consent." Kyle stopped reading. His hand no longer trembled, but his breathing caught. He recognized that handwriting, not because he had seen it before, but because it matched the tone of the woman he had handcuffed the day before. Concise, not dramatic, but like a blade slicing between layers of skin without drawing blood. He turned to the final page. One line. "You did not insult me, you insulted the network that holds this nation together." It was not a threat, it was not a legal notice. It was a direct incision into the belief Kyle had held for years in the force, that any action, once folded into the right process, became justified use of discretion. But now he understood. The very system he had used to shield himself was beginning to expel him, not through administrative punishment, but in a far clearer language. You are no longer worthy of its protection. He sat down, eyes on the papers. No one knocked again. No agents burst in. No reporters called. But Kyle Renner knew. If this system had chosen silence as its voice, then the black envelope was its opening statement, and what followed would not come from the outside. It would surface from within. Every memory, every stare, every time he had granted himself the right to suspect someone because of skin tone, vehicle model, or how calmly they stepped out of a car. No one told him to respond. No one asked for an apology, but he picked up a pen, not to write a justification letter, only to strike out a name from his contact list. Evelyn Maddox. He did not want that name appearing on any device he had ever touched, not because she threatened him, but because she was living proof of the very truth he had been running from, that law does not reside in a badge. It lives in the dignity one holds even when handcuffed. Kyle sat in his apartment late into the night. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't open the windows. The street lamp outside cast a beam through the blinds, slicing across the room like an examination light, illuminating the kitchen table, where the contents of the black envelope still lay untouched. He didn't put it away, didn't burn it, simply because he knew, from now on, what was inside that envelope was no longer something he could erase. It had already been copied, analyzed, transmitted, and securely stored on servers he would never be allowed to access. The next morning, that reality became publicly and unmistakably confirmed when the name Kyle Renner appeared in an internal memorandum from the Department of Justice under the heading Administrative Suspension Pending Full Review of Interagency Conduct History. From the 11th floor of a federal building in the city's northern district, home to the Bureau of Conductual Oversight and Analysis, CBOA, a task force was activated. This wasn't a routine inspection. These were specialists trained to handle complex files involving patterns of overreach with systemic bias indicators. Each member of the team carried a C3 level clearance, granting access to closed cases, audio logs, linguistic behavior analysis, and the use of AI-assisted logic reconstruction models. Kyle Renner's file wasn't reopened because of a single misstep. It was flagged due to signs of a recurring cognitive distortion, one that had been quietly normalized within a system assumed to be harmless. The first page of his disciplinary file recounted an incident from 3 years earlier. A Middle Eastern man was ordered out of his car and questioned for uncooperative behavior, though dashcam footage later showed he had only asked, "Why was I pulled over?" once. No raised voice, no phone, no resistance. In his report, Kyle wrote, "Subject displayed suspicious conduct and used unclear language. At the time, no one investigated further. The case was closed with a note, insufficient grounds to determine procedural violation. But now it was flagged. In not for severity, but for pattern, from phrasing used to tone, to Kyle's repeated labeling of subjects as non-compliant in cases with racial undertone. Next came the file of a middle-aged black woman stopped while waiting for the bus at night. She was in scrubs, wore a hospital badge, but Kyle insisted on additional ID verification. His report read, "This area is known for storage activities." Only one young colleague quietly said, "She's a night shift nurse." But that comment never made it into any formal record. And at the time, no one imagined that one day those reports would be cross-referenced, algorithmically analyzed, and presented to a joint review board, one that included representation from the Department of Defense. Within 48 hours, the internal system generated a behavioral analysis. Experts found that in 38 incidents involving racial minorities, Kyle used the term subject instead of citizen in 96% of the reports. In 14 of those cases, with available video evidence, Kyle had initiated the stop or check. The numbers weren't criminal, but they were systemic. That's why the documents began flowing toward the Division for Ethical and National Security Behavioral Analysis, where misjudging a citizen is no longer just an administrative issue, but a matter of structural integrity within law enforcement. In a private conference room, no cameras, no press, no defense attorneys, 12 officials sat in silence. No small talk. They had read the entire file. But what startled them wasn't Kyle's mistakes. It was how many people had signed off on those reports without question. Over 20 individuals, including 3 mid-level officers, 2 shift supervisors, and 1 district coordinator. Kyle was a problem, but he wasn't the only one. He was a product, and the first visible fracture in a chain that had just snapped. And Evelyn Maddox, by standing still in handcuffs without lowering her voice, had forced that entire chain to turn and look at itself. The final disciplinary review did not list only Kyle. It documented each repeated misconduct, every supervisor who approved them, every complicit name, with a note, file forwarded to the Office of Federal Ethics Audit Military Civilian Enforcement Coordination. This was no longer an employee evaluation. It was a reconstruction of trust, not to save anyone, but to remind the system that some actions, even when repeated enough to feel routine, remain stains no justification can cleanse. And at the bottom right of the summary sheet, a non-mandatory note was added by one board member. No individual can represent justice, but each unchecked wrong can bend the trajectory of an entire legal system. Back at home, Kyle still didn't know that from the moment he handcuffed Evelyn Maddox, he ceased to be assessed as an isolated man. He had become the embodiment of a mindset, structured, sanctioned, and normalized through habit and silence. When a person is placed under review in a file, he is no longer an individual. He becomes a symbol of what the system is deciding to keep or discard. And in that very moment, there are other voices, not echoed in the conference room, not found in any evaluation sheet, yet heavier than any formal record. They are the accounts of those who survived, thanks to the presence of someone the system once labeled as a subject for verification. On the phone screen of Martin Reyes, a video clip shared by an old teammate stunned him in the middle of his logistics coordination shift at the Missouri Military Supply Center. In the video, a black woman in civilian clothes, hands cuffed, was being escorted down the street. The footage was blurry, but the eyes... He could never mistake those eyes. They were the same eyes that had stared through a rain of bullets during the Kandahar campaign, when the entire squad had been cornered in a narrow, sandy alley with no way out. Evelyn Maddox didn't shout orders. She didn't need to. With a single hand gesture and a gaze cutting through the smoke, she pinpointed the angle for a rearguard shot. And it was Martin, the soldier who had panicked and dropped his weapon, whom she dragged from death, set behind a mud wall, and then returned alone to lead the counterattack. After that deployment, Martin was discharged with a disability rating of 40%. He didn't run for office, didn't write memoirs, didn't appear in the media. He lived quietly as a former soldier, fixing cars by day, handling supply paperwork by night. But when he saw that video, the memories didn't return like a film reel. They came back in something far more specific. His own labored breathing as Evelyn dragged him, the whistle of bullets above, and her words, "I don't leave anyone to die behind me if I'm still standing." Martin didn't know who Kyle Renner was. He didn't care about local politics, but he knew what honor meant, and he understood if someone like Evelyn Maddox could be handcuffed in the street, in silence, without recognition, then every oath of honor he had learned in the military would become meaningless if he stayed silent now. At the same time, in a small apartment in the Bronx, an elderly woman was placing an old photo on a small home altar, where incense smoke curled beside a yellowed letter. She was the mother of Reuben, a Puerto Rican officer who died in a border-adjacent operation in Somalia. In his journal, Reuben once wrote about the only commander who ever made him feel not like a disposable pawn. That person's name was Evelyn Maddox. And then, when the old woman saw the image of Evelyn being dragged like a criminal, her hands trembled, spilling a cup of water, her lips murmuring in Spanish. That can't be. Not her. She didn't know what social media was, but her grandson did. He recorded a short video. Just the grandmother, tearfully reading Ruben's letter, ending with a single line, "That woman once saved my father. Who will save her now?" The video went viral in less than 3 hours. One of the first comments came from the very chief doctor who once oversaw the field medical unit at Forward Operating Base Echo, the site where Evelyn once saved the entire infirmary during a chemical attack with improvised weapons. "I don't know what she's being charged with," he wrote, "but if Americans let her go through this in silence, then maybe we've forgotten everything we once swore in the Hippocratic Oath." The post was deleted within 5 hours, but not before it was screenshot, reshared, and turned into a banner at a small protest in front of the local city hall, where people gathered not for party lines, but because they wanted to know who allowed Evelyn Maddox to be treated that way. The heat didn't come from noise, but from how people quietly turned away from the one who had acted. At a small convenience store in Wichita, where Kyle Renner once shouted at a teenager for stealing candy, the elderly store owner behind the counter silently removed a photo that had thanked the local police unit. No one told her to do so, but every regular customer that day understood, and just hours later, a photo of that moment appeared on a veteran forum with a handwritten caption, "When justice fails to recognize the right person, respect no longer knows where to return." Even in places seemingly unrelated, like the city library, a different kind of silence began to take root. A group of high school students, upon watching the video during their civics class, stood up and, in unison, recited Evelyn's famous quote, once printed in a military science textbook, "We leave no one behind." The teacher didn't ask them to, but he also didn't, because he himself, years ago in another classroom, had once invited Evelyn to speak, and now, seeing her dragged through the street, he wondered, what had he really taught, if now he told his students to stay silent? Social media remained loud, but it was the silence in places that once honored Evelyn Maddox that began turning the name Kyle Renner into a stain no one wanted to be associated with. A cafe that used to display the slogan "Support Local Police" suddenly closed without notice, just to post a handwritten sign. "We are reevaluating what we once believed in." The note was written by the owner's son, a former military academy student who had nearly died in a training accident. The very one who had been saved by Evelyn during the exercise. He didn't go on television, didn't write articles. He simply folded the sleeve patch embroidered with the name Maddox, placed it on the counter, and locked the door. And so, without noise, without angry crowds, through small acts from individuals, from old soldiers to elderly women, from students to shopkeepers, the entire system began to show fractures, as if it no longer knew whose side to take, when the most decent people were being treated like criminals. That day, he opened his laptop, logged into the internal forum of the Special Forces Veterans Network, and wrote a short post, with no call to action, no citations, no challenges. Just a single passage. "She once held on to my life on the battlefield. Today I hold on to the truth for her in a society trying to forget. There is nothing more to explain." That post didn't go viral immediately, but within 7 hours it was shared across nearly every internal group of the Special Forces, commanding officers, and strategic training communities. From anonymous accounts to retired commanders, responses poured in, not as hashtags, not as impulsive outrage, but as words heavy as desert sand. "I confirm. I once heard her command under a flare barrage. If she's the one being arrested, then the one arresting her should be investigated." Amid this quiet surge at a National Defense Logistics Station in Virginia, Chief Technical Officer Ivan Wolf, once a trainer of rapid response units, quietly printed the post and penned it to the bulletin board outside the coordination room. No caption. But hours later, someone took it down. The next day, he was reassigned to the records department, a silent form of demotion. An old colleague texted him, "Was it worth it?" Yvonne replied with a black and white photo from the Kunar Mountains, where he had once lain motionless from a gunshot wound. And Evelyn, not assigned to medevac duty, had carried him uphill for nearly an hour. "It was worth it," Better than becoming someone with no memory. At the same time, during an internal training session at the Federal Police Academy in Colorado, a young cadet was indefinitely suspended for asking this question in class. Why are we studying the ethics of law enforcement while staying silent when a veteran like Mrs. Maddox is treated like a criminal? The instructor, a former combat commander with indirect ties to Kyle Renner, gave no answer, simply signaling the supervisor to mark the cadet on the ideological concern list. Word spread. A hidden recording of the cadet, reading Martin Reyes's original post aloud, was circulated on the internal platform with the caption, "If asking the right question is considered rebellion, then maybe the truly dangerous ones aren't on the watch list." A heavy atmosphere began to cling to places that had once welcomed Kyle Renner. A military bar on the outskirts of San Diego, where he used to boast about old photos and get free drinks from young officers, suddenly closed early on a Friday night. The owner, a retired Marine, was said to have smashed a framed picture hanging behind the counter, one showing Renner with a group of comrades during a promotion celebration. No one captured the moment on video, but the crack in the glass and a torn piece of paper with the words, "You no longer get to touch this, Pride," were blown outside by the wind, and a customer picked it up, snapped a photo, and posted it online. The only caption beneath the image, "I once congratulated him. Now I'm disgusted with myself." The silent pressure began echoing back into places that once seemed irrelevant. A military radio station that had previously published a piece praising Kyle for his efforts in bridging civil and security relations was asked to take the content down. When the editor responded that more time was needed for verification, the station headquarters was surrounded the next morning by dozens of printed pages of Martin's article, plastered across its walls by unknown individuals. No one broke in. No one shouted. There were only white sheets of paper, the final paragraph boldly printed. "No one has the right to forget her just because she was mistaken in civilian clothes." Just 2 days after the article, the U.S. Civil Military Liaison Board issued a formal notice to the Office of Federal Judicial Oversight, an official request to remove Evelyn Maddox from the list of individuals under behavioral evaluation and reinstate her as Strategic Tier Protected Personnel. This is a special classification reserved only for those who have either commanded or saved more than 10 lives in recognized operations. Evelyn had met the criteria long ago, but never activated the status. She never sought privileges, but Martin understood. Sometimes respect doesn't require privilege. It only requires someone to confirm the worth that others are trying to erase. That evening, during a closed-door meeting of senior military advisors, a printed copy of Martin's post unedited, unmarked, was placed at the center of the table. Lieutenant General Henderson, the officer who once personally pinned Evelyn's rank, pointed to the final line and told the room, "If a warrior who once trembled under gunfire can still remember who pulled him out alive, then no one has the right to forget her just because she was mistaken in civilian clothes." The meeting transcript was never released, but its message was clear enough to spark a shift from reviewing an administrative misstep to confronting a moral consequence. That when the person who once saved your life is treated as a suspect, you become the traitor to everything you once survived to defend. Evelyn didn't know what Martin had written. She didn't need to. But somewhere else in the system, someone who had once seen her stand tall at a crossroads of bullets was now standing up again, with a keyboard, with memory, with a truth that no one could bend to lighten the weight of indifference. Martin Reyes's article didn't stay confined to internal groups, nor did it die a quiet death like so many memorial posts on social media that vanish within less than 12 hours. It spread to specialized forums, was quoted by veterans, and eventually appeared in the comment section of a military podcast with over 1 million weekly listeners. And as an inevitable reaction, when a story breaks out beyond military circles and reaches a deeper layer, the layer where civilians still believe they are protected by something called the law, mass media is forced to pick a side, not because they want to, but because they can't remain still when viewers start asking, If a military general can be handcuffed in the street, what guarantees that ordinary people won't be judged guilty by a glance? The first national television channel to cover the story was a network known for its conservative stance. They opened with a probing question: are we letting personal emotions interfere with legal procedures? A silver-haired anchor, his voice deep, looked straight into the camera and said, "Service members, regardless of rank, must obey the law." The fact that an individual believed to be a major general failed to present complete identification when requested. Could that have been the primary cause of this unfortunate event? The screen then split in two. On one side, a map of Evelyn's operations in Kandahar. On the other, a photo of her in handcuffs. The banner beneath read, "Military discipline and legal immunity. Where is the line?" At the same time, the very man who had ordered Evelyn's arrest, Kyle Renner, was dragged out of the shadows. An old video resurfaced showing him shoving an elderly man off an accessible path at a train station, accompanied by the shouted words, "You've got legs, don't you? Then walk around." At the time, no one reacted, but now that clip was embedded in a special news segment titled, "When Power Doesn't Need a Reason." Waves of internet users began digging through old interactions, unearthing past cases linked to Renner, and a disturbing pattern started to emerge. This man had repeatedly been the subject of complaints, yet was consistently cleared by his own organization. The pressure mounted from every direction, and the most intense backlash didn't come from strangers, it came from the very communities that once supported him. A local police association issued an urgent statement declaring a full review of all investigative files involving Renner and the suspension of all legal immunity privileges until a clear conclusion was reached. During a public ceremony honoring law enforcement officers in the city square, where he had once been awarded a medal, Renner's name was struck from the honor roll at the last minute. The event host, a military veteran, offered no explanation, simply looked directly at the guest section where Renner was seated, skipped over his prepared remarks, folded the speech, placed it on the wooden podium, and instead read an excerpt from Martin Reyes' article. That same day, a group of students at the National Military Academy held a public screening of the video showing Evelyn in handcuffs, accompanied by a detailed summary of her heroic actions during the Korengal rescue mission. Immediately after the screening, a senior student, the son of an officer once reprimanded by Evelyn for violating combat protocols, stepped onto the stage, threw down his academy badge, and declared he was abandoning his plans to join law enforcement. The act was recorded and, within 6 hours, had garnered over 4 million views, with the caption, "If this is the system that handcuffs her, then I want no part of it." The heavy atmosphere quickly spread to places once assumed neutral. A military publisher, which had planned to release Kyle Renner's memoir as a community service autobiography, abruptly canceled the contract, posting a brief note on its homepage: "We do not publish stories when the subject himself is no longer recognized by the community as the rightful narrator." At a major bookstore in the capital, where a test copy of the memoir had once been displayed, a customer captured footage of a staff member quietly removing the book from the shelf, replacing it with a new label: "Memory is a weapon, and weapons belong in the right hands." When a local television station attempted to invite Kyle for an interview to share his perspective, the taping was canceled after the production team received hundreds of messages from veterans threatening to collectively remove all images and insignias from public venues if the segment aired. A leaked internal email showed the executive producer writing, "We are not up against an individual. We are up against the memory of hundreds who were saved by Evelyn, and memory does not have an off switch." At the deepest level, even within closed-door meetings at the Department of Defense, the name Evelyn Maddox no longer appeared as the subject of investigation, but as a moral litmus test for the entire system. The official notes did not spell it out explicitly, but one line in a screenshot of a circulated memo adjacent to the item "Proposal to re-examine the circumstances of Major General Evelyn Maddox's arrest" contained a cryptic annotation: "We cannot correct a wrong by stamping silence over memory." On the other side of the media divide, an independent television network known for its collaborations with civil rights organizations, aired a 12-minute feature centered around a single question: what is your name? The same question Kyle Renner had barked when he still didn't know who Evelyn was. The segment had little narration, just slow-motion footage of her walking across the sidewalk, a child holding up an iPad to record, and Martin Reyes recounting the moment she dragged him out of a fire zone. The video ended with one final line: "We've grown too used to believing that a badge is enough to justify suspicion, but never enough to make us ask, why didn't she need to shout for the entire system to wake up?" Immediately, two waves of public opinion flooded social media. One side claimed the incident had been politicized, insisting the military should not be above the law. The other side said nothing about the military. They spoke of trust that honor can be bent by prejudice, and that the presence of a black woman on the street is still not enough to stop a pair of handcuffs if the person looking hasn't learned how to see beyond what they expect. Evening talk shows suddenly became battlegrounds. A former police officer appeared on air and said, "I worked crime scenes for 18 years. And I can tell you, sometimes instinctive reactions are necessary." A journalist shot back, "Sir, instinct can't be an excuse for targeting someone just because she didn't fit your idea of who should be driving that car." And the audience was no longer silent. They wrote, they commented, they flooded the station with messages, not just because of Evelyn's story, but because they saw themselves in that situation. Not necessarily as the one being arrested, but as the one who had once stood silently while someone else was questioned for no clear reason. The outrage spilled beyond the digital space and began taking form on the streets. A group of veterans in old combat uniforms stood silently outside the city's police headquarters, holding no banners, chanting no slogans, only displaying a black and white photo of Evelyn, with the caption, "If she once saved you, why are you silent now?" The video of that moment went viral, prompting a major news outlet to organize a live roundtable with a law enforcement representative. When the host asked whether anyone inside the department was willing to publicly acknowledge wrongdoing, the representative simply answered, "We will handle it internally." That line was clipped, reposted, and turned into a meme of ridicule. Internally? What internal unit pulled you out of enemy fire last time? Meanwhile, political newspapers began diving deeper. An article in Military Times opened with a line cold as steel: "The issue isn't the handcuff, the issue is who wears it, and who puts it on whom." The author cited security policy experts and questioned why Evelyn's military records had not been verified at the time of her arrest. Is this a technological failure or a systematic delay? The question had no answer, but it forced federal agencies to release statements, if only to pacify public concern. A leaked account from the Office of Personnel Oversight revealed that at least 3 of Evelyn's service files had been marked as pending further verification, despite having been cleared 6 years ago. The revelation ignited widespread fury. If someone with a public combat record could face delays, what would happen to the thousands with no one to speak for them? The tension didn't stop there. In a cafe in North Carolina, Kyle Renner walked in as usual, but this time the counter staff fell silent. They looked at each other, and finally one stepped forward and said, "We respectfully decline to serve you. Here, people who disgrace those who save lives are not considered guests." The exchange, caught on internal security audio, went viral within 4 hours, topping Twitter trends under the hashtag #NotInOurCafe. The chain's official account later issued a statement: "We stand by employees who choose honor over profit." Beneath the post, thousands of comments shared past encounters with Renner, accounts of him shouting, belittling, or threatening others. Incidents once dismissed for insufficient evidence, but now resurfacing with chillingly consistent detail. And when a tabloid tried to salvage Kyle's image with a piece titled "The Invisible Pressures of Law Enforcement," the article was bombarded with so much backlash that it was pulled within 8 hours. One of the most striking comments came from an elderly woman, who didn't use her real name, simply writing, "I don't care who she is, but I once stood behind a man with a gun and she was the one who pushed me out of the line of fire. If they can treat her like this, what will happen to people like me? That short line was printed on posters for a protest in Chicago, not filled with slogans or rage, but with a face, a question, and a silence heavy enough to crush the myth that people could ignore this forever. Evelyn Maddox said nothing. She didn't write a post. She didn't appear on TV. She declined every interview request. But it was that very silence that forced the media to ask a deeper question. She doesn't need to speak. The story speaks for her. One local newspaper wrote, "We are witnessing a person who without a single statement is making an entire society confront what they once assumed to be absolute." And as the media noise peaked, something strange began to happen. Silence spread, not from those involved, but from the system. The same voices that used to shape the narrative now opted for quiet, as if tacitly acknowledging what they could no longer deny. No one issued a correction. No one refuted Martin's account. No one pushed back on what had been said, and in a world ruled by statements, that silence became the loudest proof that truth had found its place, without needing a single argument to earn it. It was in that silence that quiet changes began to take shape, not through resolutions, not through press releases, but through small actions, too distinct to be mistaken. A framed article praising Kyle Renner that once hung near the entrance of the Federal Law Enforcement Academy was taken down without a word. No order was given, no explanation offered. That first-year students said they saw a senior staff member leave a meeting room around midnight, carrying the frame wrapped in black cloth, and take it straight to storage. By morning, the notice board had been replaced with a quote from Martin, "In the line between life and death I remembered her face, not for her rank, but because she stood still when everyone else ran." At a public high school in Ohio, a history teacher canceled her planned lesson on standard law enforcement procedure and instead screened a documentary about Evelyn Maddox. When a student asked, "Why isn't this in our textbook?" the teacher simply replied, "Because sometimes the right things don't get published in time." That answer was recorded by a student and posted online. In just one day, the video surpassed 5 million views. Thousands of comments poured in from people who had once been silent, now sharing their own stories, of glances ignored, names forgotten, and lives saved by individuals who were erased from the official narrative because they didn't fit the storyteller's mold. On a nightly talk show where Kyle Renner had been invited to share his perspective, the segment quickly spiraled out of control. When the host asked about the pressure of confronting an unidentified situation, Kyle gave his usual refrain, "I was just following procedure." But the audience no longer accepted that. Crocher nodded. A woman stood up from the front row holding a faded photo, her hands trembling as she spoke. "This is my mother, saved by Mrs. Maddox from a burning building in Brooklyn. And you say protocol lets you drag someone like her through the street?" The camera caught Kyle frozen, unable to answer. The broadcast was abruptly cut short, but the leaked clip spread across every platform, captioned, "When the truth shows up, the loudest men start to swallow their words." Backstage at a national security conference in Dallas, where Kyle had once been invited as a guest of honor, the organizers received a flood of emails from sponsors demanding the cancellation of his panel. A tech corporation that had previously signed him as a data consultant announced the withdrawal of all funding. An internal source revealed, "It's not that they care about Evelyn, they're afraid of their names appearing next to his." A nameplate reading, "Kyle Renner, Rapid Response Strategist," was torn down from the event gate and tossed into a trash bin in the main lobby, where dozens of passers-by quietly snapped photos. Those images were stitched together into a viral post titled, "The only thing responding quickly now is his reputation, falling apart piece by piece." At a small bar Kyle used to frequent with old colleagues, the atmosphere had palpably shifted. He entered as he always did. But instead of being greeted, every gaze turned away. The bartender stood still, refusing to pour. A silver-haired man in the corner set down his drink and said quietly, "I used to think you were a man of principle. Turns out "You were just a man of pride." No one had intended to record that line, but it was accidentally captured by the microphone of a podcast taping at a nearby table, and by the next morning, it became the most shared quote on National Veteran Forum. Then, like the final blow to a persona once protected by medals and titles, a sergeant who had trained under Evelyn spoke out in a short video. "I learned to lead from her. She didn't teach me to shoot fast. She taught me to look closer, yet some people still can't see past a uniform." The video lasted under a minute, but carried the quiet disappointment of thousands who had once believed in the system and now saw fractures that could no longer be hidden behind any statement. As the media noise began to chip away at the hardened surface of the law enforcement establishment, and as talk shows grew weary of debating right versus wrong and shifted toward analyzing social impact, a man appeared. Not on broadcast, not via live stream, not with a question, but with a single passage of exactly 117 words, posted on the plain white interface of an internal network used by retired Strategic Command officers. His name was George Alton Duval, former Joint Operations Commander, a four-star general who had held decisive power in Middle Eastern campaigns for over 15 years, and one of the rare individuals authorized to approve strategic privileges without consulting the Chief of Staff. Duval had never publicly commented on any political or social issue since retiring. He declined all interview requests, refused to write memoirs, and never lectured at military academies. He was considered the embodiment of strategic silence, a figure both revered and feared by the system, because when he said nothing, people speculated. But when he spoke, people listened. His post included no image, no reference to media, and no legal citation. It simply read, "I don't care what the press says. I'm not interested in the legal arguments swirling around this case. I know Evelyn Maddox. I once entrusted her with command over the lives of more than 4,000 people during Operation Morning Dust. And if she says something today, I don't need to verify it. I only need to confirm this. Not once has she ever given me reason to doubt her. That is enough." Duval's post landed like a blade, slicing through the artificial silence the system had been trying to uphold. Within 30 minutes, screenshots of his words spread across private forums, places where former officers, analysts, and high-level security advisors usually avoided public statements to maintain neutrality. But this time, something broke that neutrality. A former national defense advisor who had served under 3 presidents left just 2 words beneath the post: "Understood." And, in a domino effect, the internal networks of the intelligence community went dark for more than 2 hours, not due to technical failure, but because administrators were reviewing scheduled posts, afraid that any wording placed next to Duval's name might be catastrophically dwarfed by comparison. Soon after, a classified meeting at the Department of Homeland Security was interrupted when a junior aide, checking their phone, noticed that Duval's post had been printed and taped to the whiteboard in the strategic briefing room. When asked who had done it, no one answered, but a senior official exhaled slowly and muttered, "This isn't about who printed it. It's about who dares to take it down." Unease began to spread like an invisible toxin. No smoke, no fire, only a cold truth settling into the air. No one wanted to stand against a man who had never spoken. But when he finally did, he forced the entire system to reconsider how it defines and responds to its own. On the other side of the divide, Kyle Renner appeared on a semi-glub forum, typically a space where mid-level officers shared field experience. He posted a lengthy essay attempting to reframe the actual developments of the incident, using phrases like limited information at the time of action, response consistent with procedure, and regrettable media bias. But instead of receiving the support he was used to, his post was downvoted, to the point that the platform's auto-comment feature kicked in. The top comment, with over 3,000 likes, said only one thing: "When the man who once held 4,000 lives in his hands vouches for her, Your defense is just an echo in an empty barrel. A few hours later, an audio recording leaked from a closed-door meeting of the Tactical Response Behavior Review Unit, where Kyle had once been regarded as an honorary instructor, captured the moment a senior member slammed a reinstatement proposal onto the table and said, "If you want to keep this guy, go explain it to Duvall. I'm not stupid enough to try." The clip contained no faces, no visuals, but its authenticity was indirectly confirmed when the reinstatement proposal was removed from the internal system just 20 minutes after the recording surfaced. From another corner, a group of former trainees who had attended a rapid response course led by Kyle 5 years prior began to publicly share their experiences. One wrote, "He once told me, if you want respect, make them afraid. Now I understand. Respect doesn't come from fear. It comes from people like Maddox who never made anyone afraid, but no one ever forgets." That brief post was screenshotted, printed as stickers, and placed on chairs at a defense conference lobby, right behind the row reserved for VIP guests, where Kyle's name had once been printed but was now crossed out in red, replaced with 2 scrawled words, "Name withdrawn." No one knew where Duvall was when he wrote those words, but within 2 hours, his statement had been shared over 3,000 times within senior military circles, posted in 3 National Defense Agency meeting rooms, and printed as an official document submitted to the Department of Justice with an internal note, "This is a personal declaration, but it cannot be treated as isolated." The weight of his words didn't come from his title. It came from what the system understood beneath the surface. When a 4-star general declares he doesn't need verification, he's withdrawing his trust from the entire ongoing process. And in a world governed by order and command, trust is the one asset that can't be borrowed or faked. For those who had worked alongside Evelyn, Duvall's statement wasn't just confirmation. It was a resurfacing of an image many had witnessed but never named. The image of a woman soldier, unassuming, never self-promoting, who always appeared exactly when and where the system was most likely to fracture. From Kandahar to Fallujah, from night raids at the eastern border to tense negotiations in unmarked conflict zones, Evelyn never raised her voice. But she was always the one commanders turned to when every plan began losing its moral anchor. Duvall's endorsement, though not a direct declaration of war, forced the system into a corner: either remain silent and be complicit in failure, or speak up and admit that the original judgment may have strayed from the very principles the system claims to uphold. While emergency meetings were being called one after another, outside, a photo of Duvall's post was printed, in A1 size, laminated, and hung on the exterior wall of the National Military Archives. A group of veterans had done it at dawn. No permission, no announcement. When security attempted to remove it, the group stepped back and pointed to one bold line at the bottom of the board. "Anyone who doubts Evelyn Maddox is doubting the very system that survived because of her." The removal was delayed due to a lack of orders from upper command, and by noon the image had become an impromptu photo spot for hundreds of passers-by. On the same day, a series of internal emails between the Department of Homeland Security's media advisors were leaked. In them, a senior member recommended a temporary suspension of current media strategy regarding the Maddox case, warning that any rebuttal may be interpreted as a direct insult to General Duvall. That single sentence was immediately reposted on the Retired Officers Forum, accompanied by a biting comment. "We used to fear nuclear war. Now, one retired general taps a keyboard and the entire system trembles." The sarcasm wasn't to glorify Duvall. It was to underscore what the system was desperate to avoid: a loss of control spreading from the outside straight to its core. Meanwhile, Kyle Renner, the same man who once strode confidently through conference halls with a badge reading Rapid Response Strategist, was quietly removed from the guest list of the North American Security Conference held in Toronto. A source from the organizing committee revealed, "No one banned him. We just didn't send an invitation." And no one suggested adding his name. The next day, when Renner arrived at the hotel to attend an unofficial session, his name wasn't on the check-in list. and his security badge was printed incorrectly with the wrong title, wrong unit. When he protested, the front desk clerk responded calmly, "You can correct it by hand if you think anyone will believe it." Someone behind him recorded the entire scene, and the 58-second clip became an emblem of silent dissent, a man who once carried authority, now having to write his own name on a badge, only to be met with indifference. At another seminar held that same week, a young officer, trained through a program advised by Kyle, stepped onto the stage during the closing remarks and spoke directly into the microphone. "We were taught that rapid response was an essential trait, but no one ever taught us to check who we were aiming at before we reacted. Today I officially renounce the certificate signed by Mr. Kyle Renner." The room fell silent. Two other graduates then stepped forward, removed old pins from their collars and placed them on the table. The live stream of the event surpassed 6 million views within 4 hours, not because of drama, but because the silence following the speech lasted longer than the applause. No boycott was needed. The system began withdrawing from the name it once held up as a model for situational leadership. Articles related to Renner on the Tactical Academy's internal site were quietly switched to hidden mode. A professional journal article once titled "Composure Amid Conflict, Learning from Kyle Renner" was taken down and replaced by a new piece titled "The Price of a Short-Sighted Decision." But what stirred the public most was something seemingly small. The chair bearing Kyle's name at the Special Operations Training Fund, once marked with a brass plaque of sponsorship, was stripped overnight. The person who replaced it wasn't a maintenance worker, but an elderly veteran, nearly 80 years old, his hands trembling but resolute, as he installed a new plaque in its place reading, "Honor Revoked," awaiting reconstruction of character. Inside the Department of Defense, younger personnel, officers who had never seen the battlefield, raised on spreadsheets and digital protocols, began reviewing her old files, not out of admiration, but to understand why someone once vouched for by Duvall, a hardened 4-star general, famously unyielding with subordinates, would write a declaration without undergoing any internal verification. And what they found were not polished reports, but a series of records almost entirely devoid of complaints from those under her command. An almost impossible feat in the multi-layered tactical environment of modern warfare. Evelyn had once declined a field promotion while leading a unit in Iraq, stating, "Rank does not change the accuracy of a decision on the map." That quote was written down by a young soldier and later printed on a banner that hung in the Special Operations Training Center at Fort Bragg. But it was precisely these things, the ones not mentioned in the media, not on any award lists, that moved Duvall to speak, because he knew the system might forgive mistakes, but it could not forgive silence when the only person who had remained loyal to what was right came under suspicion. That awakening crept into places once thought untouchable. In a meeting of the National Security Committee, when a department-level representative tried to preserve the stance that all procedures had been followed to the letter, a senior member, once a strategic aide during Operation Morning Dust, slammed a file on the table and said, "Some things are procedurally correct but ethically wrong. And if you can't tell the difference, the problem isn't Evelyn, it's us." No one argued, but afterward every internal email related to Kyle Renner was flagged and escalated to the Special Advisory Group for review. No announcement was made, but those present knew. For the first time in many years, the system was being forced to examine itself, not because of public pressure, but because of one sentence that left the entire room afraid to breathe too loudly. Just outside the walls, where decisions were being rewritten, Kyle's image began to fracture. A conference on risk control and law enforcement, where he was once slated as a keynote speaker, abruptly changed its schedule, without a public notice, simply by removing his name from the posters, misprinting his badge at the welcome table, and moving his seat to the back of the room. When Kyle attempted to take the stage to clarify a few misconceptions, his microphone was cut. The technician claimed the equipment failed, but everyone saw the event coordinator's unapologetic eyes. The conference proceeded with a new topic, honoring those who uphold ethics without needing titles. The hall applauded, while Kyle stood alone like a blot of ink left behind on a page already proofread and corrected. That same atmosphere spread to his old academy, where Kyle had once served as a supervising instructor. A group of cadets had secretly redrawn the field training maps, replacing all lesson markers attributed to him with models based on Evelyn's tactics in Mosul. When discovered and ordered to remove them, the cadets didn't resist. They only requested to keep one chart illustrating a non-violent tactical response when confronting an unidentified but non-threatening subject. In the top left corner of the diagram was a small caption, rewritten from memory. A seasoned lieutenant colonel who passed by stared at it for a long time before nodding and saying to the training supervisor, "If they still remember who taught them this, then we ought to remember who taught us to forget cowardice." Within the unit Kyle once served, an anonymous letter was circulated. No signature, no date, listing instances of his abuse of authority toward subordinates, using the phrase sentencing by expression to accuse those he deemed unfit. The letter ended with a single line, "I do not write to retaliate, I write to confirm." No one claimed authorship. Yet within 3 days, 3 administrative staff members from the records department requested reassignment, and Kyle's internal conduct file was reopened under the status pending reevaluation of ethical command. No one called it punishment. But every small detail was slowly peeling away the mask of a man once considered a role model of discipline, revealing instead a distorted ego that had only survived in the spaces Evelyn consistently filled with action, never with justification. And somewhere farther away, on a private forum reserved for senior strategic analysts, where Duvall had once been a founding member, a small map suddenly appeared. It had no title, only red dots marking the locations where Evelyn had commanded operations. Among them, one dot was circled, accompanied by a handwritten note. Here, she saved 7 lives with a single decision. Just below it, in an old-fashioned font, was a short line. The system should learn to remember this way, not with medals, but with clarity. And for the first time since the forum's founding, that post was not hidden behind a firewall. It was pinned to the top of the page, without moderation, without review, because everyone understood. If moderation is still needed at this point, then perhaps it's already too late. The media began to zero in on his declaration. Evening programs invited guests to analyze. Is this a covert attempt to interfere with the investigation process? Can a retired general sway public opinion? Does this statement reflect a silent bloc within the military? But the public wasn't asking for analysis. They simply shared one line from the post. "I don't need verification, I only need confirmation." A prominent commentator wrote on Twitter, "That's how a society must respond when its trust is insulted. You don't have to map out what's right or wrong, you just need to affirm what's right, so you don't lose it." As for Evelyn, as always, she remained silent. But this time, no one demanded that she speak, because the system had begun to speak for her. And those who had once been silent, the ones she had protected, led, and saved, had begun to rise, not to protest, but to prove that there are people who, even in handcuffs, command more respect than anyone seated behind a desk of power. The ripple effect was no longer in the hands of editors, but had shifted toward those once omitted from the final reports. A veteran rescued by Evelyn from a kill zone shared a long post on a small, rarely visited forum, but within 12 hours that post surpassed 1 million shares. After a well-known author quoted its final line, "I didn't rise to be a hero. I rose because I don't want my son growing up in a country that forgets people like her." The post reached academic circles where scholars began to discuss the concept of transformative trust, when one person's silence is powerful enough to redefine values previously dismissed, now embraced as standards worth defending. Inside the system itself, small tremors began to show. An internal training session at the Department of Justice headquarters was disrupted when the lead instructor, who had previously written an article defending Kyle Renner, was publicly challenged by a junior employee. She didn't yell, didn't argue, she simply held up her phone and read Duvall's tweet in front of the entire class. If the man who once held 4,000 lives in his hands still believes in Evelyn Maddox, then who gave us the right to doubt her? A spontaneous round of applause erupted. No one stopped it. And when break time arrived, nearly a third of the participants walked out, leaving behind empty chairs and a flurry of internal emails demanding a review of ethical command training standards. Those empty chairs were photographed, arranged into the shape of handcuffs, and the image became the background wallpaper on thousands of federal devices within just 2 days. At a fundraising event in New York, where Kyle Renner had been invited to speak as a tactical crisis response expert, the evening unfolded under a heavy air as dozens of guest seats remained empty. Several business people quietly excused themselves, less than 10 minutes into the program. But the turning point came when, during the slideshow of Kyle's resume, someone in the audience turned on their phone and projected the image of Evelyn in handcuffs onto the ceiling of the ballroom. No sound, just the image. The entire room fell silent. The host attempted a nervous chuckle, but no one followed. Kyle lowered his head, and the speech was awkwardly cut short. A secretly recorded clip of the moment circulated through media circles, like a silent but resounding slap. One columnist described it, "It was the first time I've seen a room full of people go as silent as at a funeral. Only the person being honored wasn't dead, and the one being silenced was still there, standing on stage." At a cafe near the Special Forces Training Headquarters, a chalkboard sign was updated with a message, "Free coffee for anyone who has served with Evelyn Maddox." When a man loudly objected, claiming this is reverse discrimination, the owner, a former battlefield nurse, simply replied, "No one's being denied coffee, but if you don't know her name, you don't understand why today's coffee is free." That statement was recorded and uploaded to TikTok, where it sparked a viral trend under the hashtag "If you don't know her name." Stores across America began doing the same, from bookstores to auto shops, all with the same quiet, unapologetic tone, not performative, not preachy, but direct, just like Evelyn herself. As for Kyle, on a visit to a military gear store, he was recognized by a staff member. The employee didn't curse, didn't ask him to leave. He simply placed a plastic training handcuff on the counter, the kind used in restraint simulations, and said, "We don't sell to people who don't know the name of the one who maintained discipline without ever needing a cuff." No one filmed it, no one posted about it. But a week later, on the wall behind the counter, a handwritten line appeared. "Here, honor is permanent stock. If you're lacking it, don't act." When a statement from someone like Duvall is released, it doesn't come with explosions, congressional hearings, or the kind of public reckoning that the media often craves. But inside offices, boardrooms, and coordination tables, where too many coffee cups sit half drunk, what it triggered was a silent shift, a sequence of doors that once seemed open, yet now no one dared to walk through. No orders were issued, no one was officially dismissed, and yet each person began to feel the fragile line between still being part of the system and no longer being considered one. And that very sensation of being shut out without being told so was the most brutal form of exclusion. The night shift supervisor at the precinct where the incident occurred, the one who had signed off on the report detaining Evelyn for an unverified identity, showed up to work right on time, but when he tried to enter the command room, his access card no longer opened the door. No one stopped him, no one explained. The desk operator simply said softly, "The system is being updated per interagency directive." He didn't argue, didn't protest. He just nodded, set his briefcase down on a waiting chair, and pulled out his phone. Not to call a superior, because he knew phones no longer connected to a system that had chosen to silence itself from within. Another officer, the one who had skimmed Evelyn's info without raising an alert, was reassigned to logistics. An invitation to sit on the interagency review panel was withdrawn at the last minute. The email gave no reason, only a line. "Protocols are being reevaluated under higher directive," and that was enough. No one questioned it. because no one wanted to hear the answer they all already knew, that they weren't being removed for what they did wrong, but for choosing not to see the wrong when it still could have been stopped. The city police chief, who had once appeared on TV saying, "We will investigate this matter seriously," entered a federal coordination meeting the following morning. No one greeted him, not out of disrespect, but as a deliberate silence, a signal that credibility no longer walked into that room with him. At the table, he opened his laptop, but the presentation failed to load. The material he had prepared no longer applied. A junior officer slid over a new packet of documents. "This is the new reporting format, effective today per department directive." Within it, all data tied to Evelyn Maddox had been flagged red, meaning any errors tied to that case would now be reviewed starting from the lowest level involved. And he, once the final signatory on her detainment, now sat in a room where no one was willing to sit on the same side anymore. At the Department of Justice, the Office of Law Enforcement Conduct Oversight received an official request from the Department of Defense, a full audit of federal procedures involving military personnel, particularly cases where protection-level clearance had not been activated. No deadline was attached, but there was one unusual detail. The review teams were not pulled from existing departments, but chosen at random from a roster of officers who had previously served abroad, worked in joint military operations, and, critically, had no indirect affiliations with the city where Evelyn had been arrested. No one called it a purge. No one used the word punishment. But the entire system had begun shrinking in on itself, casting off the links that once believed simply following orders was enough, forgetting that blind compliance is often what pulls the honor of an institution into the mud. Kyle Renner still had not been arrested, but his name no longer appeared in any meetings. He was removed from shift schedules, taken off the response grid, and erased from internal personnel systems. He hadn't been fired, but his desk was no longer viewed as a place to sit. It became a void, like scorched earth after a landmine, left uncleared and unwelcome. As for Evelyn Maddox, who never asked anyone to speak on her behalf, never penned a rebuttal, never posted a single line on social media, she still did not appear. Yet now, her absence had become a mirror, reflecting the presence of those who once believed they were invisible to accountability. Illustrates a confusing truth. And door by door, administrative positions, routine roles once seen as mere paperwork, began closing. Not by order, but by the deeply internal realization that it was time to shut down the chapters which, if reopened, would only further expose the quiet rot embedded deep within the machine. Beyond public agencies, people began to notice fewer press briefings. Familiar faces no longer stood behind microphones. Internal websites stopped updating. And within that silence, something was felt by all, though no one named it aloud. The Evelyn Maddox incident was no longer an isolated case. It protected the town. It had become a moment, and that moment had split a system in two, between those who could face the truth and those still clinging to doors that would never open again. When a system begins closing old doors, there isn't always a slam. Sometimes it ends as quietly as a song finishing on a note no one hears, but everyone feels the echo. And in that air, people began naming something new. Not a policy, not a law, not an investigation. They named it after the one person who never raised her voice, yet compelled everyone to reevaluate their role in the chain of silence that had allowed the failure to. They called it the Maddox effect. The term didn't come from a scholar. It wasn't coined in any academic journal. It started in an internal email sent by a training officer at the Oregon State Police Academy with a simple subject line: "The Maddox Effect, should we add this to next year's ethics curriculum?" The body of the email contained only one sentence. Should we begin teaching how silent complicity in the face of wrongdoing may constitute a betrayal of duty, even when one didn't directly commit the act? No one replied immediately, but within a week, the concept spread like an embedded moral code, surfacing in discussion boards, policy planning rooms, and gradually gaining tacit acceptance as meaning this: when one person remains quiet enough to make an entire system reflect, what needs changing isn't individual behavior, it's the architecture of power. Organizations quietly began updating. In several state police departments, performance evaluation charts no longer focus solely on arrests or case closures. A new column appeared on the right: situational awareness beyond pattern recognition. It wasn't a measurable metric, but it served as a reminder. When encountering someone who doesn't match your mental image of power, pausing isn't a courtesy, it's an obligation. At a few officer training academies, situational questions were revised. Once phrased as, "You see a suspicious individual in a civilian zone, what do you do?" now became, "You see someone who doesn't fit your familiar image of authority. What's your first instinct? Will you respond based on protocol or prejudice?" Some young cadets found this confusing at first, but after a class discussion, one brown-skinned, curly-haired female cadet stood up and said, "I used to think following procedure was enough, but now I realize procedure is just an excuse if I don't dare to call out wrongdoing, even if it comes from my shift partner." The story spread beyond law enforcement. Financial institutions began reevaluating how they defined potential clients, ensuring it wasn't rooted in appearance, speech, or zip code. Hospitals, once governed by internal triage codes, were asked to review systems to make sure urgency wasn't determined by subjective expectations of what a patient in need should look like. In sociology forms, the phrase, "a Maddox moment," was coined to describe incidents where a system only recognized its error too late, and the person wronged didn't react with protest, but with the composure that forced the entire process to reevaluate itself. Inside law firms, hallway conversations began to shift, where once administrative violations were evaluated by low damage, low litigation risk. Now, when someone mentioned detaining an unverified person, the first question wasn't about documents, it was she someone like Maddox? Not out of fear of repeating a mistake, but fear of returning to a state where such mistakes could occur without anyone feeling ashamed. There were no protests, no marches, but donations to local accountability organizations spiked by more than 45% in the 2 weeks following the incident. A teacher in Minnesota wrote on her blog, "I don't know military policy, but I know what it feels like when a student isn't trusted just because of how they dress." That post was shared across hundreds of civic education classrooms, standing as proof that the Maddox effect wasn't born to attack, it was born to ask. How many times have we claimed we were doing the right thing, when in fact we were just repeating the wrong thing with a calm face? National Magazine's cover story for the upcoming month ran with the headline, "Evelyn Maddox said nothing, but her silence is teaching the system how to listen." In the article, the author noted this wasn't the first time justice had been challenged by a deviation from expectation, but it was the first time the system reflected on itself, not because it had been attacked, but because it had been seen through, seen and left without a defense, seen and no longer able to deny. And when a society begins to change not out of fear but out of shame, it's no longer just an effect, it's a movement. And they named that movement not with lengthy slogans, not with legal briefs, but with 2 words, Maddox. And in those 2 words, there lives an entire new order, a truth that some people don't need to shout to make the whole system recalibrate its volume. They called it the Maddox effect, but an effect usually ends with a chart, a graph, or a summary report. This story did not, because when a society begins to name someone who never raised her voice, and uses that name as a moral benchmark to reassess how it structures power, the story hasn't concluded. It has only just begun. And at that pivotal turn, as institutions scrambled to adjust, at the very center of the movement, the woman who once walked in handcuffs without bowing her head was now being referenced in a different tone. No longer the subject under discussion, she had become the person requested to return. The call didn't come from an individual. It came from an organization, delivered through a classified internal network typically reserved for activating special assignments. The first line of the letter was an official invitation from the Interagency Procedural Reconstruction Commission, a newly formed body under joint coordination by the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, and the Office of Federal Ethical Oversight. The invitation wasn't long. There was no apology. Just one paragraph, exactly 46 words. We request Major General Evelyn Maddox to serve as a special coordinator in redesigning the Federal Strategic Personnel Identification and Handling System. This is not a reinstatement. This is an acknowledgement. Evelyn received the letter on a morning with no breeze. She was standing at the stove, boiling water for tea. Not because she needed tea, but ever since the incident she had learned to keep her hands busy while the world busied itself being loud on her behalf. She wasn't surprised, but she didn't rush to read it, because she understood. Invitations like this rarely stemmed from remorse. They arose when every other justification had failed. She placed the letter on the table and continued pouring water. Later, when she sat down, she read each word carefully, not to find flaws, but to ensure that, this time, the writers understood she wasn't returning to rescue the system. She was returning to do what the system should have done long ago: teach itself the value of integrity that requires no applause. Her decision wasn't made public, but when the name Evelyn Maddox reappeared in the internal directory of the Interagency Commission, the entire system understood one thing: this wasn't an appointment, this was a test, and they would not be given a second chance. Evelyn arrived at the first meeting not in uniform. She didn't need to, and no one dared ask her to. She walked into the large room where representatives of every agency even remotely involved in the incident. Some stood, some avoided eye contact, and a few, very few, nodded quietly as a belated act of recognition. She didn't lock eyes with any particular person, but her gaze swept the room just long enough for everyone to silently wonder, had I contributed to that chain of silence, even with just a nod, or by remaining quiet when it mattered most? The session's chair gestured for her to speak. Evelyn didn't begin right away. She pulled out a slim folder containing a list of 7 principles, standards she believed a strategic personnel system must uphold if it were serious about preventing failures like the one she endured. Each point was brief, clear, devoid of legal jargon, but each line sliced directly into the heart of what the system still tried to dismiss as a temporary procedural lapse. When she reached the 5th point, all verification procedures must be designed in reverse, not to exclude but to ensure no one remains unseen by prejudice, the room fell completely silent. One administrative director closed his eyes for 3 seconds. Not from fatigue, but because he had once written a policy that did the exact opposite, and now he was hearing it overturned, not with indictment, but with a tone that allowed no rebuttal. Evelyn didn't speak at length. Her entire statement lasted 17 minutes, mirroring the exact number of seconds she used to call the Department of Defense on the day she was handcuffed. She didn't mention the incident. She didn't need to. Her very presence here, in a role she had been invited to, not dragged into, was already the answer to what the system now had to admit. Some wrongs cannot be undone by apologies. They must be corrected through the presence of the person who bore their consequences in silence. The meeting ended. There was no applause, no landmark declaration, but each attendee left that room with something clearer than any memo. The woman who was handcuffed that day hadn't returned to claim justice. She had returned to teach them that justice must never be tested on the backs of those least able to carry its weight. When the meeting ended, no one stood up too quickly, not out of hesitation, but because everyone understood. What had just occurred wasn't merely a presentation. It was a reinstatement of order, not by power, but by principle. And that principle wasn't delivered by Evelyn through a raised voice or sharp wit. It was articulated through perfectly timed silence, through a gaze directed squarely at the places others usually skim past. and through a short list that forced an entire system to remember, not by memory, but by the visceral desire to never repeat the same failure. Everyone assumed the hardest part was over, that Evelyn would continue her role as coordinator, that the system would continue its self-correction through internal assessments, and that what needed to be done had been done. But then she came back, exactly on the third day after the first meeting. No appointment, no summons, just a single email sent to the Central Coordination Office. There is one case in the 2021 interagency file that was not processed correctly. A request to full trace. The case number she referenced was not hers. It had no connection to any military personnel. It belonged to a black homeless man, arrested for suspicious behavior near a municipal administrative area. Unarmed, non-resistant, yet taken in on the grounds of non-cooperative gestures and unclear speech. The incident never sparked public outrage. No viral footage. No voices raised. The file simply stated, unable to verify identity, administrative clearance per protocol. The final line, handwritten by the processing officer, read, "Case closed." No one claimed. Evelyn knew about that case for a very simple reason. Back then, while working as an auxiliary advisor for the Special Situation Coordination Office, she had come across the report during a routine cross-audit. She requested it be retained. But when she was later informed that the man had passed away 2 days after being released, no one deemed it worthy of further attention. No next of kin. No formal complaints. No one is concerned. That was the system's final verdict. But she hadn't forgotten, because the death of someone whose name never made it into the system is the biggest hole the system constantly tries to cover with paperwork. She didn't ask for a formal investigation. She didn't demand criminal accountability. The only thing she did was request that the case be brought into an internal hearing, not to find out who was wrong, but to pose a simple question. How much paperwork does it take to legitimize a death no one is willing to claim responsibility for? The hearing was held in a smaller room, fewer people, but the weight was heavier than in the first session, because this time no one could hide behind the role of a bystander. The file was opened. Those who had signed it, who had glossed over details, who had crossed the man's name off the watch list, all were present. Evelyn did not sit at the head of the table. She chose a seat at the far end, yet every gaze turned toward her when the simulation of the incident was replayed. Not dramatic, not violent, not confrontational, just footage of a man standing under an awning in the rain, unable to state his name clearly, pulling out no phone, carrying no ID, and then being taken away, quietly, calmly, disappearing. When the video ended, no one spoke. Evelyn waited another minute, and then she said, "Not to accuse, but to conclude, we have built a system capable of overlooking people, if those people don't know how to prove they deserve to exist." She didn't blame anyone. She didn't request compensation. The only thing she did was open the file and place a new sheet on top, clearly stating the man's name, age, and fragments of information she had collected from traffic cameras, hospital records, and a woman who used to see him at church every Saturday. His name was Leroy D. Hampton, not an unidentified male, not an unverified black individual, not the case closed. He was a real person, and when Evelyn placed that sheet on the table, no one dared push it aside. No one said it's too late, because they knew justice is not about timing. It is about whether we still dare to acknowledge a failure, even when there's no one left alive to reclaim the justice owed. She never knew the woman's name. Not when the video went viral, not when the media labeled it a pivot point in how the system re-examines itself, not when the world argued over who was wrong. She still didn't know who the woman was. To her, that woman wasn't a military rank, wasn't a moral icon, wasn't a general in handcuffs. She only knew this. That was the first person she'd ever seen walk in silence and cause a crowd to stop. She was 12 at the time. The iPad she held that day wasn't for filming anything serious. She brought it as a way to pass the time while her mother went into the bank. She stood under the awning with a group of strangers. It had just started to rain. Then came shouting. She saw 2 officers approach a black woman. The woman didn't raise her voice, didn't resist, didn't lash out. She stood frozen, unmoving. The adults around her began murmuring. Some took out their phones, but didn't record. Others took a step back, as if to avoid being involved in whatever was coming. She didn't know what made her raise the iPad and hit record. It wasn't because she wanted to be a witness, and it wasn't because she thought she was capturing some great truth. She just wanted to hold on to that look from someone in handcuffs who didn't bow her head, didn't glare back, didn't ask anyone for mercy. That gaze wasn't directed at the officer holding her arms, but at something farther away, somewhere only those who had gone far enough knew how to return from in silence, yet still made others realize they were wrong. When she got home, she didn't post the video online. She showed it to her mother. Her mother, a quiet elementary school teacher who always taught her not to interfere in adult matters, paused the video right as the woman was pushed into the car. She didn't say anything, then gently asked, "What did you see in her eyes?" The girl couldn't answer, but for 3 nights afterward she dreamed of that look, not as something frightening, but as something she needed to understand, even though she didn't yet have the words. Years passed. The clip was later shared when her mother sent it to a friend working at a local newsroom. People watched. People commented. They debated procedures, laws, authority, and privilege. But no one asked her, "What does the girl with the iPad think now?" Because to them, she was just a lens. But to her, that gaze had stayed, not inside the camera, but in how she began seeing everything differently from that moment on. The girl from that day is now a junior majoring in social psychology. She no longer has that old iPad. It broke during a move at the start of the academic year, but the video inside it remains whole in her memory, like a second skin no amount of time can peel away. In the midterm essay, the professor asked the class to write about a personal moment that changed how they define the word justice. The room fell silent, as if everyone sensed they were about to touch something deeper than textbooks. Her classmates wrote about court cases, about films, about famous incidents covered in Intro to Political Science. Some wrote about violence in the communities they grew up in. Others cited documentary scenes that made them cry. But she, the only one not opening a laptop, took out a pen and wrote by hand. No references, no citations. Just a rainy day, a city sidewalk, an iPad, and the gaze of a woman who said nothing. She never mentioned Evelyn Maddox. No photos, no description of the handcuffs. She simply wrote, "I used to think justice was something people acknowledged, but that day, I saw someone who needed no recognition and still made society stop in its tracks. And I understood. Justice doesn't come from above. It comes from the refusal to step back, even when silence lies ahead, emptiness behind, and bias unnamed on either side." The professor didn't write much. He left one line at the bottom. "This essay doesn't analyze theory, but it makes me ask, in 30 years of teaching, have I ever paused long enough to see something like that myself?" That comment was photographed, shared in a closed student group, then unintentionally surfaced on a higher education reform forum, where no one knew her identity, but hundreds left comments like, "I know I saw something like that once, but I didn't stay long enough to understand it." A few weeks later, she received an email invitation to a small campus seminar titled Unrecognized Witnesses and Social Impact. At first, she declined, but the night before the event, rereading her essay, she realized some stories only carry weight when told by the one who was there, not through theories but through first-hand clarity. She accepted. It was the first time she spoke about the clip, not at length, not a full retelling. She chose one part, the moment when all the adults around her stepped back, and she, a child, was the only one who raised a device to preserve the silence no one dared confront. In that small auditorium, filled with faculty, students, and a few guests from advocacy groups, no one interrupted, but someone bowed their head, someone placed a hand over their heart. A journalist who had once worked for the local news quietly took off their press badge and placed it on the table as a wordless act of apology. When a faculty member asked, "If you could go back to that moment, would you do anything differently?" the room held its breath. She answered without hesitation, "No, I'd do it the same." But this time, I wouldn't need the iPad. I'd look directly. A second passed. No one clapped. No one chanted. But for the first time, that silence no longer meant avoidance. It became a space of undeniable agreement. That day, as she left the room, a light rain began to fall. People dispersed. But a first-year student stepped toward her, hair damp without an umbrella, and whispered, "You didn't record that video because of justice. You did it because you saw what everyone else tried to ignore. And I think that's the beginning of all kindness." She smiled, not because of the compliment, but because she understood silence was still spreading. But now, it wasn't just the silence of the victim. It was the stillness preparing a generation to see things clearly, even when no one had yet taught them how to look. The memory of that girl with the iPad never made it into the files. It wasn't listed in the investigation. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't a witness. It was never cited in any systemic reform meeting. But that didn't make it any less valuable. On the contrary, what wasn't written down, what wasn't counted, what wasn't called by its name, was often what revealed just how far a society had veered off course and how it happened. Because what never makes it into the report is often what made the wrongdoing possible. No report ever said that Kyle Renner once studied under an instructor who ridiculed those who didn't look the part of law enforcement. No one noted that he had referred to suspicious behavior 3 separate times as a way to protect himself, not others. In his internal training evaluations, his performance was rated as consistent, procedurally compliant, but no one wrote that this kind of consistency, the kind that never questions anything, was precisely what made him unable to distinguish between a real threat and a woman who simply drove legally and happened to have a face that didn't match the templates he was taught to trust. There was no record of the look on the duty officer's face that morning, the one who saw Evelyn being brought in but never asked a question. He didn't sign any papers. He didn't authorize the arrest. He didn't conduct the interrogation, so he wasn't held accountable. But no one asked, in a system built on cross-checks and collective responsibility, why were so many people quiet enough for a wrongful act to pass by as if it were simply routine? No incident report documented how Chief Day clenched his jaw when the words Major General Evelyn Maddox flashed on the interagency clearance screen. No one recorded that he stood outside the conference room for 11 full minutes before stepping inside to deliver an apology that was never recorded, because apologies, when they arrive too late, cease to be actions. They become admissions. No one wrote down the act of a logistics staffer, someone usually assigned to internal document transfers, who quietly printed a copy of Kyle's altered report, labeled it personal backup, and slipped it into an anonymous envelope addressed to the Interagency Commission. She was not a whistleblower. She was not protected under whistleblower regulation. But without her act, the case would have closed like hundreds before it, with a line that read, "Incomplete assessment, but no procedural violation." Nowhere in the official files was it mentioned that the iPad, which captured the moment, had nearly been wiped when a tech employee attempted to optimize large data sets in the video management system. He wasn't fired, he wasn't sued, but he never came back after that day, and no one asked why. No report questioned why internal investigation documents always list "nah," "nay," but never include images. No one openly stated, because images can reveal skin color, and skin color can expose what written words are trained to avoid. No risk assessment ever addressed how the system fails to recognize correctly, often avoiding law enforcement not because they're guilty, but because they know the system can make them criminals with a single wrong keystroke from someone who never learned how to see. No report listed that the 5 people who witnessed Evelyn being handcuffed that day, 3 adults, 2 pharmacy employees, and 1 taxi driver, offered any statements, not out of fear, but because they believed there must have been a reason she was arrested. One middle-aged man among them, after the clip went public, quietly called the police department's hotline, hoping for an explanation. But when the operator flatly said all procedures followed legal protocol, he hung up without giving his name. The way he stayed silent after the war, as if he were still defending an order he never fully understood, but had once believed couldn't be wrong. A week later, he returned to that pharmacy where 2 employees had seen everything and asked a simple question. If that had been your mother, would you have stood still? No one answered. The question drifted into the silence, as if touching a crack the whole city had learned to tile over. In that same pharmacy, one female employee deleted the store's surveillance footage after the incident, not out of fear of getting caught, but believing if there's no evidence, no one else will get hurt. But when the news reports started circulating, she realized that in the public clip, there was a brief moment, her eyes, visible from behind the counter, watching, unblinking, saying nothing, doing nothing. From that moment on, she began attending church every Sunday evening, not to pray, but to relearn how to face a truth she had once passed over like a harmless habit. The worn-out belief that if something bad happened, the victim must have done something wrong. That belief was what kept the system running without needing to fix itself. And worse, it was reinforced through internal meetings, where the question, why didn't she cooperate, always came up before anyone dared to ask, has anyone ever apologized to her? Until it was challenged by someone who didn't need to shout to make the system stop. No file documented that Evelyn Maddox had once been denied access to borrow books as a student because the library staff believed she didn't belong to the elite officer track. The librarian, a woman with reading glasses on a chain, proud of keeping standards, once made Evelyn fill out the same form 3 times, citing unclear academic purpose, even though Evelyn had a recommendation letter and transcripts. The 4th time, Evelyn stopped trying. She went back to her room and photocopied draft texts from images a classmate had taken. Those scans, blurry, crooked, incomplete, were what she used to finish her thesis. When the paper received top marks, the reviewer never knew some of those citations were typed from memory, not borrowed books. No report noted that it took Evelyn 3 applications to be considered for the task force because her file lacked strategic value, even though her scores were exceptional. On the 2nd attempt, a conservative former commander scribbled a handwritten note into her file, competent, but tends to act independently of orders. That line didn't make it into the official version, but it was enough to delay her file by 2 years. When Evelyn was finally accepted after the 3rd try, she replied with a single sentence, I won't act independently of orders. I just won't betray reason. No one wrote down how she often walked out of meetings when someone laughed while she spoke. Not because she was fragile, but because she knew if she reacted, they'd use her reaction to erase what she said. Once, during a preliminary hearing for a proposal on frontline officer protections, she suggested prioritizing internal misconduct monitoring. A senior officer chuckled from the back and muttered, another one who thinks she can take on the whole system. Evelyn stood, left the table, not to retreat, but to start again, where that laugh no longer echoed. Nowhere was it recorded that in 15 years of service, Evelyn never evaluated a subordinate the normal way. She always began assessments with one question. Can this person see what the system is missing? Just that. Not performance, not procedural compliance, but the ability to see what no one else wants to see. Thanks to that question, at least 3 officers once flagged for disciplinary review were retained. Not because they excelled, but because they were the first to notice flaws in a rapid response policy that their superiors wouldn't admit. And not a single report, not after hearings, not after federal panels, not across hundreds of pages of reform policy, captured the most crucial truth, that real reform doesn't start with errors. It begins with the silences that allowed them, carried by people who believed they weren't part of the story. Nowhere in the hundreds of pages of official reports does it say that Evelyn Maddox never returned to the place where she had once been handcuffed, not because she was afraid, not because she held a grudge, but because that place no longer required her return. Where she belonged was no longer the intersection with the roar of traffic and a drizzle that day, but the nameless meetings, the draft rewrites of new protocols, the subtle corrections of seemingly harmless phrases in training manuals, and the blank spaces still left unacknowledged, because to write them down would mean rewriting the entire way the system functioned. Evelyn understood that change is never complete, and it never comes from just one person. What she did was never meant to conclude the case, nor was it to complete a journey, because deep down, she knew. Every ethical act remains unfinished unless it is continued by someone else, with the kind of patience only integrity can sustain. After the day she left the Interagency Commission, no press release was issued. No photos of her appeared in major publication. The people who had sat at the same table with her continued their work, only now they hesitated longer before skipping over lines labeled insufficient data and paused for an extra second before discarding a case file with no clear sender. It wasn't a legacy. It was a quiet shift, one only those who had once been pushed to the system's margins could make from within. 1 month later, in a city over 500 miles away from where the incident had occurred, a young officer declined to detain a woman for improper street crossing after she failed to present identification. It was already dark. The street was nearly empty. A previous patrol report had flagged the area as having potential for unlawful gathering. Pressure crackled over the radio. Run further checks. If unsure, apply temporary detainment. But the officer didn't lay a hand on her. Didn't instruct her to freeze. Didn't search her bag. He simply asked, "Where are you coming from?" The woman answered plainly, "Walking back to my mother's. This road has no sidewalk." No hesitation, no resistance, just the voice of someone too tired to re-explain something that shouldn't need explaining. His official justification was concise. Insufficient basis to establish risk behavior, but beneath that line, he scribbled a small handwritten note, non-mandatory, not part of any standard procedure, just someone going home. Not an incident. That line should have been deleted when the file was digitized, but the data clerk didn't remove it, not because he forgot, but because when he read "going home," he thought of his mother, once detained after forgetting her wallet on a grocery run, made to stand and wait for verification in front of an entire parking lot. And so, the internal copy of the report kept that note intact, a description not recognized by the system, but one that made the system feel ashamed. The file was not made public, but when submitted, the supervising officer, 2 decades in the force, reviewed it and said nothing. He simply stood up, leaned in, and murmured into the young officer's ear, "If someone named Maddox hadn't existed, you would have handled that differently." Then he walked away without waiting for a reply. That same day, a regional radio segment was abruptly cut during an interview with a police chief expert discussing intervention protocols for non-compliant subjects. The station later blamed it on a technical error. But among the engineering team, one technician saved the segment before it aired. In that clip, a voice said, "If someone can look you in the eye and you still choose not to believe them, the problem isn't the person being looked at." That quote eventually made its way across social media. Source unknown. Referred to only as the reason why so many have stopped trying to explain. Further away, a high school teacher began assigning students to write about someone unacknowledged who once did the right thing. She never mentioned Evelyn. She didn't require political research or legal analysis. She just asked her students to think about something textbooks never teach, that sometimes what matters most isn't being right, but daring to hold on to what's right when everything around you chooses to look away. One student wrote about his grandfather, who once helped a dark-skinned stranger escape an aggressive police check at a train station by stepping forward and saying, "He's with me." The story was only a paragraph long, but when read aloud in class, the room fell silent. The teacher said just one sentence. Sometimes, standing beside someone is the only form of justice the powerless have to give. At another police training center, a senior instructor suddenly filed for retirement mid-semester. No one knew why. But days later, on his desk, someone found a notebook, not a formal report, but a handwritten log of mismanaged incidents from the past decade. In the margin of one page, he wrote, "I used to think I wasn't wrong, but I never dared ask, was what I believed enough to keep others from being harmed?" The notebook was never published, but a hand-copied version circulated quietly among training circles. an unofficial textbook of moral responsibility the system had never formally acknowledged. A young writer adapted the case into a short story posted on her blog. The protagonist had no real name, but readers knew. The story ended with one line: "She didn't win." But after she walked away, no one dared call injustice normal again. The story was never published officially, but it was quoted more widely than any institutional speech ever was. As for Evelyn, after everything, she never held a permanent position. She didn't attach herself to any title. She chose no stage to speak from. She declined every invitation, every award for service to justice, because she believed if someone needs recognition to keep doing what's right, then that society is not ready for justice to exist on its own. She walked more. Sometimes she'd attend community meetings where no one knew her name. She didn't speak. But facilitators often noted how someone sitting quietly at the back made everyone at the podium choose their words more carefully, not out of fear, but from the awareness that someone once said nothing and still made the entire system rewrite the way it perceives itself. Evelyn Maddox was not the end of the story. She was the comma placed exactly where it needed to be, to remind everyone that every act of decency, if mistimed, becomes just another regret buried inside reports that never have enough space to document all that should have been done. Evelyn Maddox left the final meeting just as the wind began to shift. No one escorted her out. No one waited. There was no nameplate, no journalist, no choreographed handshake. But none of that slowed her steps, because she wasn't walking out of a conference hall. She was stepping out of a chapter of history that should never have existed. A chapter so quiet it could have easily repeated itself had no one been sharp enough to ask a question so simple that most avoided it altogether. Why didn't we see? People continued to say her name afterward, but no one ever named it right. They called her a hero, a survivor, a witness, a symbol, but no one dared call her what truly terrified them most, the person who made them question themselves. Because among all the titles, none sting more than being a mirror to the compromises we've convinced ourselves were harmless. The city where it all happened now has new signs. Traffic lights have been upgraded to smart sensors. The Administrative Processing Center now displays citizens' rights in multiple languages. The glass doors are frosted to deter voyeuristic stares from the outside. Everything appears orderly, disciplined. But amid all these changes, Evelyn walked straight through. She didn't stop to look at the signs, didn't slow her pace. She just went to one place, the awning where she had once been handcuffed, and stood still. The corner was no longer crowded. No more street vendors, no child with an iPad, no horns blaring from across the intersection. But one thing hadn't changed: where she stood, right in the middle of the street, straddling the line between legality and bias, between two sides that never dared name the truth. She stood, not to reflect, but to confirm that she was still here, not as a story, but as evidence that remained open. 12 blocks away, a classroom was wrapping up a discussion on citizenship and responsibility in modern society. The board still had messy chalk lines outlining the concept of critiquing power, and sunlight through the windows divided the room between silence and unease. A quiet boy, rarely one to speak, raised his hand for the first time. He didn't look at the teacher. He looked out the window and asked, "If the wrong one is the government, who's held responsible?" The class fell still. The teacher, with 15 years of experience, once confident that every question had a standard answer, paused, then replied, "The system." Her words landed with a weight of concession, neither wrong enough to protest nor right enough to comfort. And just as she thought the moment had passed, another student, the girl in the back who often journaled in purple ink, spoke. "But if the system says nothing, then who is responsible?" No one answered, no one dared, and no one insisted on an answer. But from that moment on, the atmosphere shifted, not because of what was said, but because of what no one dared to say next. The next day, the class received a civic ethics survey, a standardized questionnaire from the Department of Education titled "Encouraging Critical Thinking on Social Responsibility." But when they reached question 12, "What would you do if you witnessed misconduct from someone in power?" every student marked the last option, stay silent, not because it was the neutral choice, but because they knew it's what they had already been taught, not through textbooks, but through the averted eyes of adults every time the system made a mistake. Weeks later, a woman passed through the same intersection, now with new traffic signals, repaved sidewalks, and surveillance posts. She paused before a newly installed sign. The wind blew through her silver-streaked hair. She read the inscription in fine stainless steel. Some questions don't need answers. They just need to no longer be ignored. No one claimed authorship. No formal document authorized its creation. No one signed off on it. But no one took it down either, and no one protested. As if, for the first time, silence wasn't being used to conceal, but to acknowledge that something had finally been seen and would not be forgotten. That same week, a records clerk at City Hall, while reorganizing old files, found a draft memo titled Proposal to Review Media Exploitation of Law Enforcement Imagery. It had been prepared to counter public backlash after Evelyn's incident, but was never submitted. The author had resigned. Instead of discarding it, the clerk wrote a note in the margin, "Do not send. Not needed. They've already corrected themselves in ways they never imagined possible." 1 year later, she became the first to propose a local extracurricular program on understanding institutional failures. As for Evelyn, after everything, she never returned to work for any agency. She moved to a small riverside town, taught part-time, grew vegetables, lived in a house with no number, no nameplate, no cameras, just 2 wooden steps and a weathered mailbox, always filled with handwritten letters, sent with no official address, but always reaching her. Those letters weren't printed in newspapers. They weren't stored in any official archive labeled Citizens of Merit. But in every slanted sentence, every ink blot that bled like tears, were words the system never dared to write. Like one from a former state security officer, "I no longer serve. Not because I was dismissed, but ever since I saw you say nothing and still made me ashamed, I knew I no longer deserved to stand for what is right." No one formally concluded the case. No official record named Evelyn Maddox a historic figure. But in a civic class in the suburbs, they now tell the story of a woman who was handcuffed but never bowed her head, and in the end, it was the system that bowed to her, not through declarations, but by no longer staying silent about what it had once called normal. And if this story must close with anything, it is not with a conclusion, but with a final question, not to be answered, but to never be forgotten. If we hadn't handcuffed her that day, would the system have ever realized it needed to change? What you've just heard isn't just a story, it's an alarm, and sometimes the only thing that can carry an alarm further is someone who listens, thinks, and chooses not to remain silent. If you've stayed with us until this very moment, I believe you too. Have questions you've never said aloud. Moments where you witnessed something unjust but didn't know what to do. Or perhaps you've been the one misunderstood, cast aside just for not fitting into someone else's idea of how you were supposed to be. Leave a comment. Tell me about a moment when you saw yourself in this story, or a time you wished you could go back and do things differently. Don't just scroll past, because every story you share is more than a response. It's living proof that there are still people willing to face the truth and who believe that justice doesn't have to shout to be heard. If you find meaning in what I'm doing, please share this video with more people, and don't forget to subscribe so I can keep telling stories that don't just move us but awaken us. Because sometimes change doesn't begin with those in power. It begins with an ordinary person bold enough to ask a question which no one has ever answered before. And maybe, just maybe, that person is you.